I remember the taste of that night first. Not the expensive drink itself, not the brand or the garnish or the price on the menu, but the way the cold glass felt against my fingers and the small, familiar burn at the back of my throat as I took slow, measured sips. I held it the way some people hold a hand they know they should probably let go of, loosely but not quite ready to release it. Outside the tall windows of the bar, Manhattan glittered in all its self-conscious holiday glory. Wreaths with perfect bows hung on polished doors, tiny white lights wrapped around street trees, yellow cabs sliding by in a steady, muffled stream. Christmas Eve in New York has its own sound if you listen closely enough. It is quieter than you would expect from a city that prides itself on never sleeping. There is a softer edge to everything, as if even the traffic is willing to keep its voice down for one night. Sitting there on a leather bar stool that probably cost more than my first couch, I let the low murmur of conversation and the gentle clink of glass lull my mind into a slower rhythm. I could feel my breathing steadying, in and out, matching the rise and fall of the room around me. On paper, I was exactly where I had set out to be. Eve Simon, 33 years old, senior advertising executive at Bernstein and Barlow, Madison Avenue. A tidy, upward-pointing line on the career graph, the kind that made recruiters call and younger assistants glance at me with a mixture of admiration and mild fear. My apartment was high above the city, in a building with a doorman who knew my name and my coffee order. My closet was full of beautiful things, my schedule was full of important meetings, and my life was full of almost nothing that felt real. I watched a couple at a table near the window, their heads tilted close together. She had one hand wrapped around a mug, the other resting quietly on his arm. Nothing grand was happening between them. They were just there, sharing the same small circle of warmth in a wide, glittering city. A part of me, the part I didn't like to acknowledge, ached with a simple childish envy. My world was all big gestures and high stakes, but the small, ordinary gestures suddenly seemed like the ones I had misplaced somewhere along the way. My phone vibrated once on the bar beside my cocktail napkin, the buzz low and discreet. I already knew who it was before I turned it over. Neil's name glowed on the screen, accompanied by a brief, tidy message confirming what he had already told me in his office that afternoon. Plans changed. Family needed him. We'd pick another weekend, he promised. Something special. Something just for us. I read the message twice, as if words might rearrange themselves into something less familiar. They didn't. I set the phone face down and traced the rim of my glass with my fingertip, slowly, letting a small circle of condensation form on the sleek, dark surface of the bar. I had known, somewhere under the layers of professionalism and rationalization, that this was always a possibility. Married men are consistent in at least one way. Holidays have a gravitational pull they cannot defy. It wasn't even the broken plan that hurt the most. It was the sudden, sharply clear image of myself in my apartment later, the lights of the city spilling in, the television politely murmuring in the background, while I sat with takeout and a glass of something expensive, pretending that this was enough. The bartender, a man with kind eyes and a tie loosened just enough to look approachable, asked if I wanted another. I shook my head and smiled, the polished, easy smile I had perfected for clients and award dinners. "I'm good, thanks," I said softly. He nodded and drifted away, and I let my shoulders slowly drop a fraction of an inch. I became aware of my body in that moment in a way I usually wasn't. The quiet tension that lived in my neck and across my shoulders loosened as I exhaled. My back rested against the bar stool, My feet, in elegant heels that were never designed for comfort, found a more forgiving position on the footrest. I closed my eyes for a few breaths and just listened to ice in glasses, to soft laughter, to a jazz version of a Christmas carol playing gently over the speakers. This was the life I had chosen. 8 years ago, I had turned my back on tulle and vows and a small-town bookstore and walked into the bright, commanding arms of New York City. I had told myself that when you get the kind of opportunity I had and coveted internship at Bernstein and Barlow starting the day after Christmas, you take it without looking back. And I hadn't looked back. Not really. Not in a way that allowed the memories to fully light up. I had kept them folded and tucked away like an old photograph in the back of a drawer. A fragment of a memory slid into my mind then, as gently as snow landing on a windowsill. The smell of paper and coffee and pine needles. A little bell on a door jingling as people came in to escape the cold. Scott's Books and More, painted in slightly uneven letters on the front window, the kind of imperfection that only made it more charming. And Scott himself, standing behind the counter with a stack of returns, his hair slightly tousled, a pencil tucked behind his ear, looking at me like I was his favorite story. I took another slow breath and opened my eyes, and the bar came back into focus. I checked the time. It was still early by New York standards. People rushed through their last-minute dinners and drinks before heading home to families, parties, or candlelight services. I did not have any of those waiting for me. Well, that wasn't entirely fair. Mandy had invited me to her place. She had done it in that determined big sister way of hers, even though she was technically 2 years younger than me. "I'm serious, Eve," she had said earlier that week, leaning into my office doorway with a stack of files hugged to her chest. "My mom makes enough food for 20 people. You won't be intruding. You'll be rescuing me from hearing the story of my great-uncle's gallbladder surgery for the 7th Christmas in a row." I had smiled and given her a vague answer, something about seeing how work played out, about flights and meetings, and let me get back to you. I didn't tell her that I had been clinging to the idea of going away with Neil, of being the chosen one for once. It was not the sort of thing you could say to someone who had known you since you were 8 and had seen you cry over a failed math test and a bad haircut. Now, sitting there in the soft glow of the bar, I wished I had said yes to her without conditions. I thought about calling her, but it felt like stepping into a story I hadn't prepared myself for. I wasn't ready to explain why I suddenly had no plans, and I didn't want pity, especially not from Mandy. She loved me too much to hide it well. I reached into my bag, feeling the smooth lining under my fingers, and wrapped my hand around my wallet. A decision. Simple and small, formed with the kind of quiet certainty that only comes when you're very, very tired of your own patterns. I settled my tab, left a good tip, and stepped out into the December night. The air on the sidewalk greeted me with a crisp, cool embrace, sharper than the controlled warmth of the bar, but not unfriendly. I pulled my coat tighter around myself and watched my breath puff out in front of me, a small white cloud dissolving into the city's glow. The street was festive without being frantic. Twinkling lights framed the dark sky between buildings, and a light dusting of snow from earlier in the day still clung to the edges of sidewalks and the tops of parked cars. Christmas lights in New York are different from the ones back home in Eastborough. Here they're curated, intentional, sometimes extravagant. Perfectly matched colors, designer windows, towering trees and hotel lobbies. Back home, lights were a little crooked, a little mismatched. One strand would blink while another stayed stubbornly steady. But in both places, I remembered that same quiet feeling of walking under them, as if the world was trying its best to be gentle for a while. I walked without rushing, my heels clicking a slow, rhythmic pattern on the pavement. People passed by wrapped in scarves and puffy coats, cheeks pink from the cold. Some carried shopping bags, some held the hands of children in bright hats, some simply moved with that brisk, determined New York stride that never quite goes away no matter the season.
The city around me felt like a snow globe that had been shaken and was now slowly, peacefully settling. As I walked, memories continued to unfurl, uninvited but not unwelcome. My father's voice, laughing as he wrestled a too large Christmas tree through our front door in Eastborough. My mother humming along to Parles while stirring something on the stove. My little brother Evan leaving out cookies for Santa with all the solemn focus of a mission-critical operation. And Scott, sliding an arm around my shoulders as we stood in the tiny, cluttered bookstore after closing, looking at the tree he had insisted on squeezing into the corner by the front window. "You know," he had said, brushing a stray hair behind my ear, "this place is practically magical at Christmas." "That's because you put cinnamon sticks near the heater so it smells like cookies," I had replied, laughing. He had grinned. "Some magic is simple. Doesn't mean it's not real." The memory made my chest feel both warm and tight. I slowed my pace, letting the city move around me.
Somewhere, a street musician was playing a carol on a saxophone, the notes long and smooth, rolling out into the cold air like a promise that everything would be all right, eventually. The sound seemed to sync with my steps, with the gentle rise and fall of my breath. In that moment, there was nothing I had to sell, no pitch I had to refine, no client I needed to impress. There was just a woman, walking alone on Christmas Eve, listening to music and the distant laughter of strangers. By the time I reached my building, my body felt heavier, in a pleasant way. The kind of heaviness that comes when you've been moving for a while and finally decide to stop. The doorman greeted me with a warm, "Good evening, Miss Sinan," and I smiled back, grateful for the simple routine. In the elevator, the soft overhead lighting reflected gently on the sleek walls. I watched my own reflection, composed and polished in a tasteful coat and perfectly applied makeup. I looked exactly like the woman I had worked so hard to become. And yet, underneath the surface, something was quietly shifting, like snow beginning to slide from a crowded branch. Inside my apartment, the familiar scent of my own space welcomed me. A hint of my favorite candle, the clean linen smell of laundry, the faintest trace of the perfume I always sprayed before walking out the door. The city lights spilled in through the large windows, softer now, more distant and dreamlike. I hung up my coat, slipped off my heels, and let my bare feet sink into the plush rug. The silence in the apartment was complete, but it did not feel hostile. It was just there, waiting to be filled with whatever I chose. I padded into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and then moved to the living room, turning on the small tree I had bought more out of obligation than enthusiasm. The tiny white lights blinked sleepily to life, casting a gentle glow over the room. I stood for a moment and just watched them. My breathing naturally slowed, each inhale a little fuller, each exhale a little longer. The rise and fall of my chest was easy, unhurried. I could feel the tension of the day softening at the edges. I could have turned on the television, let a movie or a Christmas special fill the quiet. Instead, I walked over to the window and rested my hand against the cool glass. The city stretched out below, dotted with lights and hints of color. Somewhere out there were families gathering around tables, friends exchanging gifts, children trying to stay awake long enough to catch a glimpse of magic. I tilted my head back slightly, searching for a star. It was silly, I knew. Stars in New York were shy, often hidden behind the brightness we created ourselves. But after a few seconds, I found one. Faint, but steady, peeking through a small gap between buildings. There was a part of me that still believed in wishes. It was the same part that had believed 8 years ago that love and ambition could somehow travel side by side without ever pulling apart. The same part that had packed a suitcase and walked onto a plane, leaving behind a dress, a church, a bookstore, and a man with earnest eyes. "Okay, I whispered to that little speck of light, feeling slightly ridiculous and strangely comforted at the same time. Just show me if I did the right thing, or give me a chance to understand it better. That's all. The words left my lips in a soft breath, almost like a prayer, though I had never been particularly religious. They hung in the air for a moment and then dissolved into the quiet of the room. I stepped away from the window, my body reminding me how long the day had been. A pleasant heaviness settled into my muscles, and a gentle drowsiness began to wrap around my thoughts. I changed into soft pajamas, the fabric warm and familiar against my skin, and turned down the covers on my bed. As I lay down, the coolness of the sheets gave way quickly to the warmth of my own body. I pulled the blanket up around my shoulders and let my head sink into the pillow. The faint hum of the city outside became a kind of white noise, a steady, distant murmur that made the room feel cocooned and safe. My eyes drifted closed as my breathing fell into an easy, slow rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The images in my mind floated gently between present and past. The bar's warm glow, the bookstore's wooden shelves, the lights of Manhattan, the crooked lights on houses in Eastborough. For once, I didn't try to force the memories away. I let them drift as they wanted, like snowflakes tumbling lazily through the air. Just before sleep slipped fully over me, I had the distinct sensation of being exactly between two lives, as if one hand still rested on the polished bar in New York and the other on the worn counter of Scott's bookstore. It was a fleeting feeling, gentle and weightless. Then the city, the bar, the phone, the tree, everything faded into the soft, soothing darkness of sleep. And somewhere beyond my closed eyes and my peaceful breathing, a small, sarcastic angel named Brother James stretched his wings and said, "Finally."
The first thing I felt was the pillow. It was wrong. It was too flat, too familiar in the wrong way, like something I hadn't touched in years but knew instantly by the way it cradled my head. My body noticed it before my mind did. I shifted a little, expecting the gentle give of my expensive mattress and the faint hum of the city outside my window. But instead, the springs beneath me creaked softly, the sound small and homely, and impossibly distant from Manhattan. I took a slow breath in and out, keeping my eyes closed for a moment. The air smelled different too, warmer somehow, less filtered. I caught the faintest hints of laundry detergent, dust, and something sweet, like cocoa powder or cinnamon clinging to the walls. I could hear a heating vent ticking as it warmed, and somewhere, very far away, a car drove past on a quiet street, its sound fading almost before it arrived. "This isn't my apartment," my mind whispered, in a voice that was calm but utterly sure. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was low and familiar, painted in an off-white color that had never quite looked clean, no matter how many times my mother had threatened to repaint it. A tiny crack ran from the corner of the light fixture toward the wall, like a lazy lightning bolt. I had traced that crack with my eyes 1,000 times as a teenager, lying awake and thinking about anywhere else. My heart gave a slow, heavy thump. I turned my head. The room was small, cozy in the way that happens when space is limited and life insists on filling it anyway. My old dresser stood against the wall, the one with the slightly crooked top drawer that always stuck if you pushed it too hard. A corkboard hung above it, crowded with tacked-up photos and postcards. On the opposite wall, my bookshelf, there it was, bowed gently in the middle from the weight of too many paperbacks and old-school notebooks. My gaze slid toward the corner, and my breaths fell into a steady, measured rhythm, as if my body were trying to anchor me before my mind caught up. There, on the narrow desk beneath the window, sat my old CD player. Next to it was a neat stack of jewel cases, the bands and singers of my teenage years lined up in their plastic sleeves. A cheap desk lamp with a slightly dented metal shade leaned toward a pile of index cards and pens. The curtains, blue with tiny white stars, faded from the sun, framed the window. Outside, instead of skyscrapers, I saw the pale light of a small-town winter morning, washed over the roofs of neighboring houses and the tops of tall, dark evergreens. The sky was the soft gray of early day, the kind of color that promises snow without making a fuss about it. I sat up slowly. My body felt different. Lighter somehow. My hair brushed my shoulders in a way it hadn't in years, and when I pushed it back, my fingers found the texture of the inexpensive shampoo I used to buy on sale. My hands looked younger. Still my hands, but with smoother skin. No faint line where my favorite watch usually sat, no meticulously manicured nails shaped at an upscale salon. My heart thumped again, a little faster this time. I could feel it, steady but insistent, echoing in my chest. This can't be real. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, and my feet sank into the thin, familiar rug on the floor, pink with little faded flowers, worn down in the center from years of being the landing spot for countless mornings. The air felt chillier down there, cooler against my bare ankles. I shivered slightly, but not unpleasantly. The house felt alive in the way only a family home does. Tiny sounds, settling wood, distant movement. I took another slow breath and stood.
The room greeted me like it always had, but my mind moved through it as if I were walking inside a memory. On the dresser, my old hairbrush with a few strands of lighter, younger hair caught in the bristles. Next to it, a small jewelry box with a tiny ballerina on the lid, frozen mid-twirl. On the corkboard, a photo of Mandy and me, side by side in our high school graduation gowns, grinning with an earnest, uncomplicated joy that made my chest ache to look at it. My eyes drifted lower to another photo, me and Scott, taken in front of the bookstore at sunset. He had one arm around my shoulders, and I was leaning into him, both of us squinting slightly against the glow of the sky. The sign above the door read, "Scott's Books and More," in those same slightly uneven letters I had remembered the night before. My breathing stuttered once, then evened out again, slower now. Inhale, exhale. I moved toward the mirror, the one taped to the back of my closet door. For a moment, I hesitated, my fingers resting gently on the doorknob. It felt like standing on the edge of a diving board, knowing the water is there, but not quite ready to plunge in. Then I turned the knob and pulled. The face that looked back at me was mine, but it was my 25-year-old self, the Eve I had been the last time I lived in this house. My hair was a little longer, my skin unlined by long nights in an office and too many cups of coffee. There was a softness to my features that time and effort had gradually smoothed into sharper angles. My eyes, though, were the same. They carried the knowledge of my 33 years of New York and Neil and late nights under fluorescent lights. "Okay," I whispered to my reflection, my voice soft, as if I didn't want to wake anyone up. "This is new." New? Oh, sweetheart, this is vintage. This is limited edition. This is you circa 1996. I gasped and spun around. He was leaning against my doorway as if he had strolled in a minute ago and gotten comfortable. He looked ordinary in the way that only someone truly out of place can. Jeans, a slightly rumpled button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to the forearms like he was halfway through a task he'd abandoned. His hair was dark and just a little messy, his expression somewhere between amused and fondly exasperated. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. Somehow, even standing barefoot in my old bedroom, younger and utterly disoriented, I still sounded like a woman who had faced down Madison Avenue boardrooms. He raised an eyebrow.
You mean you don't recognize the guardian angel assigned to your remarkably stubborn soul? I blinked. My what? He sighed theatrically, though there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Guardian angel. You know, wings, paperwork, the whole celestial HR situation. Brother James at your service, and for the record, this assignment came with a warning label. I stared at him for a long moment. My mind moved through the usual sensible explanations first. Dream, hallucination, extremely vivid stress reaction. But the pillow felt real, the rug under my feet, the way my hair brushed my neck, the coolness of the air, the faint smell of my childhood home. And now this man, this Brother James, standing in my doorway, arms crossed, watching me, with a patience that felt older than the house itself. I took another slow breath, letting it steady me. If this was a dream, it was the most grounded one I'd ever had. If it wasn't... Okay, I said quietly, let's pretend, for just a second, that I accept that. Why am I here? Like this, in this time? He smiled then, a softer expression that settled over his face like a warm light. Because, he said, last night, a certain high-achieving advertising executive looked up at a Christmas star and made a wish. And, more importantly, because you've been walking around with a whole life you never fully examined, someone upstairs thinks you deserve the chance to look again. I sank down on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked in the same familiar way, and I felt the mattress dip under my weight. My hands rested lightly on my knees. I could feel the rhythm of my breathing, slower now, deeper, as if my body understood that panic wouldn't help. This is December, I said slowly, piecing it together. Christmas. The wedding. Brother James nodded. December 19th, 1996, to be precise. You've got a few days, enough time to pay attention, if you choose to.
My heart gave another quiet thud. December 19. The days leading up to the wedding that never happened. I remembered that week in fragments. Last-minute fittings, family arriving, flour dust in the kitchen as my mother baked too much on purpose, Scott staying late at the bookstore and then showing up at our front door with paper cups of hot chocolate, both of us standing on the porch and talking about the future like it was a place we already owned. "And what exactly am I supposed to do?" I asked. He tilted his head, regarding me with a mixture of kindness and mischief. "Live it," he said simply. "Pay attention. Make choices. You already know how one version of this story ends. This is your chance to see what else is possible. Maybe you make the same choices. Maybe you don't. No guarantees either way." I swallowed once, feeling the dryness in my throat, the realness of it. "So if I marry Scott this time," I said slowly, tasting the words, "I wake up in 2004 and everything is magically different? I'm in a different life? The bookstore is thriving? I'm happy and good and no one is cheating on anyone?" He laughed, a soft, warm sound that somehow didn't feel mocking. "Oh, Eve," he said gently, "you know life doesn't work on simple cause and effect like a 30-second commercial. This isn't a trade-in program. You don't get a guaranteed upgrade for choosing door B." I stared at the floor, at the pattern on the rug, at my bare toes curled slightly against the cool fibers. "Then what's the point?" I asked quietly. He waited until I looked up, until our eyes met. "The point," he said, his voice softer,
is that you've been living inside the story of a decision you made when you were young and scared and standing at a crossroads. You decided that loving someone meant you'd have to give up yourself. You decided that his obligations would always outweigh your dreams. You never let yourself stay long enough to see if that was true. You left, and then you built a life on that one assumption. He paused, letting the words settle. This, he went on, gesturing around the room, is an opportunity to walk back through those days with the wisdom you've earned since then. To look at Scott and your family and this town and yourself and ask, what's real here? What's fear? What's love? What am I choosing? That's all. No promises. No neat bow. I let his words sink in, drifting slowly through me like snowflakes landing one by one.
Outside the window, the light had grown brighter. I could see the tops of the trees more clearly now, the way a thin layer of frost clung to the branches. Somewhere in the house, pipes groaned softly as water began to run. Someone else was awake. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Brother James smiled gently. "You're already doing it," he said. "You woke up, you're breathing. That's step one. The rest is just moments, one at a time. You're good at that when you let yourself be." He straightened and pushed away from the doorway. "I'll be around," he added. "I have to pretend to be subtle about it, but I'm not very good at subtle. If you talk to yourself in public, I'll try to keep people from thinking you're completely losing it." Despite everything, a small, unexpected laugh escaped me. It felt like a tiny release valve opening somewhere in my chest. "Great," I said dryly. "Celestial comic relief. Just what I needed." He grinned. "Now that sounds like the Eve I've been briefed on." With that, he stepped back into the hallway and was gone. No flash of light, no dramatic whoosh of wings, just the quiet absence of someone who had been there a second ago. The doorway was empty, framing only the familiar wallpaper of our upstairs hall. I sat there for a long moment, listening. The house was waking up. I could hear my father's voice downstairs, faint but distinct, humming along to some old song he always put on during the holidays. The smell of coffee floated upward, rich and comforting. Footsteps creaked in the hallway. My brother, probably, moving with that half-awake heaviness that comes with being a teenager on a winter morning. A wave of emotion rose in me, so gentle and so deep that it moved more like a tide than a surge. I hadn't heard these sounds in years. In 2004, my holidays were office parties and catered dinners and polite, polished conversations. Here, now, the world was smaller, but it felt like it held more heartbeat per square foot. I stood up again and walked slowly to the window. My hands rested on the sill, feeling the slight chill of the painted wood. I looked out at the quiet street, the familiar houses, the thin plume of smoke rising from a neighbor's chimney. The world outside was simple and ordinary and full. I watched my breath fog the glass as I exhaled. "Okay," I murmured, more to myself than to anyone else. One moment at a time. I turned away from the window and moved through my room with a growing sense of groundedness. I picked out clothes from my closet, an old sweater, soft and worn at the cuffs, and jeans that fit the body I remembered. The fabric felt different from what I had grown used to in New York, less structured, more forgiving. As I dressed, I noticed the small sensations, the cool brush of denim against my legs, the warm slide of cotton over my shoulders, the way my hair tickled the back of my neck. By the time I reached for the doorknob, my breathing had settled into a calm, steady rhythm. My heart felt full, but not frantic. There would be big questions to face, conversations to navigate, old feelings to revisit. But right now, there was simply a staircase to walk down, a kitchen to step into, a family to see again. My hand closed around the doorknob, the metal cool in my palm. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the familiar creak beneath my bare feet sounding, for the first time in a long time, like a welcome. It was unmistakably the beginning again.
If heaven has a waiting room, I'm convinced it smells a little like my parents' kitchen on a winter morning. As I stepped carefully down the stairs, one hand trailing along the smooth wooden banister, a wave of warm air greeted me, carrying with it the scents of coffee, toast, and something buttery in the oven. Each step creaked in its usual place, and the familiar sounds wrapped around me like a well-loved blanket. Drawers opening, the soft clink of plates, the distant buzz of the old refrigerator. By the time I reached the bottom step, my breathing had fallen into an easy, quiet rhythm. Inhale, warmth, coffee, cinnamon. Exhale, tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. I paused for a heartbeat in the doorway to the kitchen. There they were. My mother stood at the counter in her robe, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, glasses perched on the end of her nose as she peered into a mixing bowl. She had that same look of concentrated care I had seen 1,000 times before, as if the fate of the world depended on getting the batter just right. My father was at the small table by the window, one hand wrapped around a mug, the morning paper folded in half in front of him. His glasses were pushed up onto his forehead, forgotten. The light coming through the window was soft and pale, hinting at frost outside. It touched the side of my father's face, picking out the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones that came more from smiling than frowning. I felt something inside my chest loosen, just a little. "Morning," I said. My voice came out a bit smaller than my usual New York tone, but it fit the room. It fit this version of me. My mother's head snapped up. Her whole face brightened in that unconcealed way only parents and small children manage without embarrassment. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "You're up early. I thought you'd sleep in while you still can." My father turned in his chair, his expression softening when he saw me. "There's my girl. Big week ahead, huh? Final countdown. The wedding." The words fluttered around my ribs like small birds trying to find a place to rest. I stepped fully into the kitchen and let the warmth do its work. The floor was cool under my bare feet, but the air wrapped around me like a hug. I moved to the cupboard without thinking. My muscles remembered the path, even when my mind felt like it was walking through a dream. I took down a mug, the chipped one with little snowflakes painted haphazardly around the rim. "You want coffee, honey?" my mother asked, already reaching for the pot. "Yes, please. Thank you." Hearing myself say thank you to my mother for pouring coffee felt oddly formal, like I was visiting rather than living here. And yet, as she filled the mug and handed it to me, her fingers brushing mine, the contact felt steadying, real. I inhaled the steam slowly, feeling it warm my nose, my throat, my chest as I took a tentative sip. I sat at the table across from my father. The chair creaked in the same familiar way, its legs sliding slightly over the vinyl floor. The newspaper between us featured headlines I hadn't seen in years, names of politicians and events I had long since filed away into the past drawer of my brain. I didn't focus on them. Instead, I let my eyes rest on my father's hands, strong, square, fingers ink-smudged from the paper. He looked at me over the top of the page and asked, "How's my bride-to-be?"
The phrase struck my ears gently, like a memory repeating itself from far away. Bride-to-be. In 2004, people called me things like rising star, asset to the firm, the future of this account. Here, now, I was something softer, something that belonged in a house, not just a corner office. I'm okay, I said, honestly. Just feels like a lot. My father nodded, as if that was exactly the answer he had expected. It is a lot. It's supposed to be. Big changes, big feelings. Doesn't mean anything's wrong. I let his words soak into me, each one a warm drop in the cool pool of my thoughts. My mother set a plate of toast between us, the butter melting in small, glossy patches. She glanced at me sideways, a little smile tugging at her lips. I dreamed last night that we all showed up at the church and I hadn't made any of the food, not a single thing. I woke up in a panic and then realized I had 3 lists and a freezer full of casseroles. I laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that surprised me with how natural it felt. That sounds like your version of a nightmare, I said. Of course it is. I have a reputation to maintain. As they went back and forth, my father teasing about her catering empire, my mother swatting him lightly with a dish towel, I sat there and simply absorbed. The familiarity, the ease, the small jokes. Each sound and scent settled gently into me, like snowflakes landing on a still pond.
In 2004, I would have given almost anything to pause the world like this. To have one morning with no looming presentation, no client feedback, no carefully crafted image to maintain. Here, the only expectations seemed to be that I eat something, breathe, and eventually show up where I was needed. Loved. "Scott called earlier," my mother said casually as she reached into the oven. "He's going to stop by after he opens up the store. Something about dropping off a box of sample programs from the printer." My hand tightened slightly around my mug. Scott. His name curved through the room and seemed to hang there, soft and solid. My heartbeat responded with a slow, noticeable thump. Not a jolt, just a deeper note in the steady rhythm. "Oh," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. "Okay." My father watched me over his mug, an almost imperceptible smile in his eyes. "You know, most people can't wait to see their fiancé. You don't have to play it so cool." I smiled back, an echo of my professional, polished expression, but warmer around the edges. "I'm not playing it cool," I said. "I just haven't had coffee yet." "Mm-hmm," he murmured, unconvinced but amused. As we ate, I let myself simply be there, one bite at a time. The toast was crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, tasting of butter and the faint tang of the bread my mother always bought on sale. My coffee cooled slowly, each sip grounding me further. My breathing remained slow and even, syncing with the gentle rhythm of the household. Eventually, I excused myself to get ready, which for once did not mean armor-plating myself for a day of office politics and client calls. It meant brushing my hair in the bathroom, with the slightly foggy mirror, pulling on a warm coat and boots, and letting the day unfold. By late morning, I was standing outside Scott's Books and More. The sight of it made my chest tighten and soften at the same time. The front window framed a small, slightly overstuffed world. Rows of books, a few holiday decorations, a string of colored lights that blinked somewhat irregularly along the top. Someone had taped paper snowflakes to the glass, each one slightly different, edges a little wobbly. The painted sign above the door was just as I remembered. Scott's Books and More, in hand-lettered script, the apostrophe slightly crooked. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cold air on my cheeks. My breath left a faint, temporary cloud on the glass as I exhaled. Inside, I could see movement. Someone behind the counter, a familiar shape leaning over a stack of something.
I placed my hand on the door handle. The metal felt chilled, smooth under my fingers. I pulled it open. The little bell above the door chimed, its bright sound cutting gently through the cozy quiet inside. The rush of warm air greeted me with the smell of paper and ink and coffee. There was a hint of something else, too. Maybe the cinnamon sticks by the heater, or a candle burning somewhere out of sight. "Be right with you," came a voice from behind a shelf. The sound of it traveled through me like a familiar song on a distant radio. I took a slow step inside, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The world outside narrowed to the aisles of books, the wooden floor, the soft overhead lighting that made everything feel a little like a story itself. Then he appeared. Scott stepped out from behind the display, a box of new arrivals in his arms. His hair was slightly tousled, that same endearing messiness he never quite managed to tame. He wore a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves and a faded t-shirt underneath, jeans that had clearly seen their share of workdays. His eyes, earnest, open, warm, landed on me. For a heartbeat, I felt both 25 and 33 at once. The younger Eve who knew only this town, this man, this future. And the older Eve who had walked away, carrying that man's face like a ghost in the back of her mind. His expression shifted quickly from concentration to a wide, easy smile. "Hey," he said, the word full of simple affection. "There she is, my favorite almost wife." I laughed softly, the tension easing a notch. "Hi," I replied. He set the box down carefully on the counter and moved towards me, wiping his hands on his jeans out of habit. When he reached me, he leaned in and kissed my cheek. His skin was warm against mine, his touch gentle, familiar. The contact sent a quiet ripple through me. Not a dramatic shock, but a deeply ingrained recognition. "Are you okay?" he asked, stepping back just enough to look at my face. "You seem a little far away." Far away? How could I explain that I was, in some strange, impossible way, 8 years and a whole life away, standing here with knowledge of outcomes we hadn't reached yet? "I'm here," I said simply. "Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, accepting that. "Fair enough. Wedding week. Kind of a big deal." He slipped his hand into mine, fingers warm, calloused gently from lifting boxes and rearranging shelves. The familiarity of the gesture, the lack of hesitation, made my heart ache in a quiet, complicated way.
"Come on," he said. "You want to see the new display? I finally got those holiday editions in." He led me down one of the aisles, our footsteps muffled on the worn wooden floor. As we walked, my body relaxed into the pace of the store. Slow, unhurried, the kind of rhythm that invites lingering. My breathing matched it, inhaling the scent of paper and leather and dust motes dancing in the soft light. He stopped by a small table near the front, where he had arranged a selection of books with festive covers. Deep reds, greens, gold lettering. A small ceramic snowman stood guard at one corner, slightly chipped at the base. "What do you think? Too much? Not enough?" I was going for cozy, independent charm and not, "Please rescue us, we're desperate." I smiled, taking in the effort, the care, the little touches that were so unmistakably him. "It's perfect," I said, and I meant it. He watched me for a moment, his expression softening. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes I still can't believe you're doing this, marrying me, staying in this town and putting up with my crooked displays and my terrible puns." In another life, the one I had already lived, those words had been the starting point of my fear. The idea of staying had felt like a trap, like a net being drawn gently but firmly around me. Here, now, holding his hand, breathing in this warm, book-scented air, the word felt different. Not entirely without weight, but not as suffocating as I remembered.
I swallowed gently, feeling the movement in my throat. "Do you ever wish—" I began, then stopped myself. He tilted his head. "Ever wish what?" "That you didn't feel responsible for this place. That you wanted something beyond Eastborough. That you'd rather come to New York with me and chase— what? Long nights in offices, lukewarm takeout, and affection that came with conditions?" I breathed out slowly. "Do you ever wish you'd done something else, instead of taking over the store?" Scott looked around, as if the shelves might answer for him. His gaze traveled over the aisles, the tables, the little reading nook in the corner with 2 mismatched chairs. "Sometimes," he admitted, surprising me with his honesty. "Not in a big dramatic way, just in those moments at 1 a.m. when I'm trying to figure out how to pay for the next shipment and still have enough to fix the heater." He looked back at me, and there was no accusation in his eyes, only openness. "But then I unlock the door in the morning and I smell the books, and some kid runs in to pick up the next fantasy novel in a series they're obsessed with, and Mrs. Palmer sits in the corner with her tea and tells me about her cat. And I think there are worse ways to spend a life." A tiny, quiet warmth spread through my chest. "So you don't feel trapped?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. He squeezed my hand gently. "No," he said. "I feel responsible and a little scared sometimes, but also proud. This was my dad's dream, you know? Keeping it open feels like continuing a story instead of closing the book halfway through." I looked at him, really looked at him. The younger Scott I remembered had always seemed so sure, so rooted, that it had frightened my more restless, ambitious heart. Hearing him admit to fear, to moments of doubt, made him feel more human. Less like an anchor dragging me down and more like a person doing his best to hold something precious together. A bell rang again, softly, as the door opened and a customer stepped in. A man in a heavy coat, hat dusted with frost. Scott gave my hand one last squeeze and gently let go. "Duty calls," he said lightly, "but I'm not done talking about this. Or about you. Or, about the whole 'till death do us part' thing." He smiled. "Stay as long as you like. Make sure the snowman doesn't fall off the table. He's fragile." As he moved away to greet the customer, I drifted toward the reading nook and sat down in one of the chairs. The cushion was a little lumpy, the upholstery faded, but it welcomed my weight in that way furniture does when it knows you for a long time. I leaned back, letting my body sink into the chair, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I listened to the quiet murmur of Scott's voice, the friendly tone he used with everyone, the way the customer's reply rose and fell. The heater hummed softly nearby, radiating a slow, steady warmth. My breathing settled again. Inhale, paper, dust, comfort. Exhale, old anxieties, bit by bit. Brother James did not appear in person, but I felt a kind of amused presence hovering at the edge of my awareness, as if he were somewhere between the shelves, arms crossed, watching me. "Okay," I thought quietly, almost like a prayer. "I see it. I see that maybe, just maybe, I didn't know everything back then." The customer left eventually, the bell chiming again softly. Scott glanced over at me, smiling as he wiped his hands on a cloth.
"Hey," he called gently. "You doing all right over there?" I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I'm just taking it all in." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his work. I stayed in that chair for a long time, letting the slow, gentle rhythm of the bookstore wrap around me. No demands, no ticking clock, just shelves and stories and the quiet possibility that the version of the past I'd been carrying all these years might not be the whole story. When I finally stood, my body felt pleasantly heavy, like you do after a long, easy walk. I smoothed the front of my sweater, took one last deep breath of the familiar air, and walked up to the counter.
I should go help my mom. She's probably wrestling with pie crust. Watch out, he replied with a grin. You know she has strong opinions about pie. So do I said. We'll manage. Scott leaned across the counter and brushed his fingers lightly over the back of my hand, a fleeting touch full of trust and assumption that we were, unquestionably, in this together. Dinner tonight? I'll close up a little early. We can go over the seating chart again, if you want. In the other life, the one where I left, those little practical conversations had felt like weights being added to a scale that was tipping towards suffocation. Here, they felt gentle. Not a trap, but an invitation. Yeah, I answered softly. Dinner sounds good. As I stepped back out into the cold afternoon, the bell chimed behind me. The air kissed my cheeks with a cool, bracing touch, but my chest felt warm. I watched my breath appear in front of me, then disappear back into the winter light. One moment at a time, I reminded myself. As I walked slowly home, boots crunching lightly on a thin layer of frost, I realized something. This second chance wasn't about erasing who I'd become in 2004, or pretending that ambition and New York and the woman who had survived there didn't exist. It was about standing in both lives at once and learning, gently, to see more than one version of myself as possible. The trees along the sidewalk shimmered faintly under a dusting of ice. The air was still, the town quiet, like it was holding its breath just a little, waiting. I took a slow, steady breath of my own and let it out, feeling my body relax, step by step, as the path ahead, uncertain and familiar all at once, opened gently before me. By late afternoon, the town felt wrapped in a kind of gentle hush. The sky had settled into that soft winter gray that seems to dim the edges of everything without turning the world dark. As I walked back home from the bookstore, my boots made a muted crunch on the thin layer of frost coating the sidewalk. Every breath I took puffed out as a small cloud, appearing and disappearing before I could properly see it. My body moved at an easy pace, not rushed, not dragging, just steady, one step at a time. The houses along our street were dressed for the season in their own humble way. Strings of mismatched lights traced roof lines and porches. Wreaths hung from doors, some simple, some overloaded with ribbons and ornaments. In a few windows, Christmas trees glowed faintly, their lights visible even in the gray afternoon. It all felt quieter than New York, but fuller in a way that had nothing to do with noise. By the time I reached our front walkway, the tips of my fingers were pleasantly cool inside my gloves, and my face felt gently kissed by the cold. I paused for a moment at the end of the path and looked at the house I had grown up in. Our porch light was already on, casting a warm circle over the steps. My mother's favorite evergreen wreath hung on the door, slightly lopsided but determined. Through the front window, I could see the soft glow of lamps and the faint flicker of the television my father liked to keep on as background noise. I took a slow breath in, feeling the air fill my lungs, and let it out slowly. My shoulders dropped a fraction, some small tension easing. Inside, the house met me with warmth and the smell of something baking. "Eve, that you?" my mother called from the kitchen. "Yeah, it's me," I answered, closing the door gently behind me and hanging my coat on the familiar hook. I slipped off my boots and let my feet rest on the cool entryway floor for a moment before stepping into my slippers. In the kitchen, my mother stood at the counter with her sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her hands and the front of her apron. Several pie crusts, already nestled in their tins, lined the counter like a row of little promises. A radio on the shelf played holiday music softly, the volume low enough that it didn't compete with the gentle clatter of mixing bowls and utensils. "There you are," she said with a smile, brushing a stray strand of hair off her forehead with her wrist. "How was the bookstore?" I moved to the sink to wash my hands, feeling the warm water flow over my fingers and palms, rinsing away the chill from outside. I searched for the right word, comforting. She glanced over at me, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Comforting, huh? That's good. We like comforting, especially this week." I dried my hands and leaned against the counter, watching her work for a moment. The steady rhythm of her movements, roll, lift, trim, crimp, had its own soothing cadence. My breathing seemed to fall into step with it without me even trying. I asked if I needed help. She said always. "You can start peeling those apples if you don't mind, and try not to eat half of them before they make it into the pie this time." "No promises," I said with a small smile tugging at my lips. I pulled a bowl toward me and picked up a paring knife. The apples were cool and smooth in my hands, the skin shining faintly under the kitchen light. As I slid the blade carefully around each one, the thin strips of peel curled softly down toward the cutting board. The simple, repetitive motion made my mind quiet in a way I hadn't realized I needed. We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the music filling the spaces between sounds, the scrape of knife against board, the rustle of parchment paper, the hum of the oven. "So," my mother said eventually, her tone casual, "how's my future son-in-law today?" I paused in the middle of peeling, the apple turning gently in my hand. "He seems," I thought back to Scott's face, the way his eyes had softened when he talked about the store, the way he'd admitted to being scared sometimes. "He seems good. Busy, tired maybe, but good." She nodded, reaching for another crust. "He's carrying a lot on those shoulders of his. That store is no small thing." "I know," I replied quietly. She glanced at me again, more closely this time. "And how are you feeling about all of this?" she asked. "Honestly." The word hung in the air between us. Honestly. My first instinct was to reach for the polished, reassuring answer, the one that would smooth everything over and keep everyone from worrying. I could almost hear myself saying, "I'm fine," or "just excited." But the memory of Brother James's voice nudged at me gently, reminding me that this whole strange second chance was about more than just repeating old lines. "I'm a little overwhelmed," I admitted, my voice soft but steady. "It's a lot of change in a short amount of time. And I keep thinking about what the future is going to look like and whether I'm really ready for it."
My mother set down the crust she'd been working on and wiped her hands on a towel before turning to face me fully. Her expression was kind, attentive. "It's okay to feel that way," she said. "Big decisions don't stop being big just because they're good ones." "How do you know they're good?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it. She considered that for a moment, leaning back against the counter. "You don't, not completely," she answered. "You just do the best you can with what you know about yourself and the people you love. You ask yourself if you trust them, if you trust you, and then you step forward and learn the rest as you go. Her words were simple, but they settled into me with surprising weight. What if, I began, then trailed off, searching for the right way to put it. What if I'm afraid that choosing one thing means closing the door on everything else I might have been? She smiled in that way she had when she recognized old fears in new clothing. Oh, honey, she said gently, there will always be roads you didn't take. That's just math. But you're not a door that closes and locks forever when you make a choice. You're a person. You'll keep changing, learning, growing, no matter where you live or what job you have or what your last name is. I listened to her, my heart feeling both tender and a little sore. Do you ever regret anything? I asked. She looked down at the dough in front of her, smoothing it with her fingertips. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd stayed in the city after college, or if I'd taken that teaching job instead of working at the library. But regret? She shook her head. Not really. I made the best choices I could at the time, and I ended up with your father, with you and Evan, with this messy kitchen and too many pies. It's not glamorous, but it's mine, and I like who I am in this life. Her words lingered, warm and steady. We fell into silence again, each of us working on our tasks. The bowl of peeled apples gradually filled, their pale slices glistening faintly under the kitchen light. My hands moved automatically, and my mind drifted. In 2004, I had spent so much time trying to prove that I was the kind of woman who belonged in boardrooms, who could handle million-dollar campaigns, who could impress people like Neil. I'd built a version of myself that was sharp and polished, always ready with an answer, always moving on to the next achievement. Here, in this kitchen, with flour on the counter and music playing softly from a tiny radio, I felt different. Softer, maybe, but not weaker. Just more present. At some point, my father wandered in, drawn by the smell. Is it safe to come in here, or is this a high-security pastry zone? Only dangerous if you try to steal a slice before dinner, my mother warned. He kissed her cheek, then ruffled my hair lightly as he passed behind me, something he'd done since I was small. I smiled in spite of myself and leaned slightly into the familiar gesture. The evening unfolded in small, gentle moments. Evan came home from wherever teenage boys go in small towns on winter afternoons, stomped snow off his boots, and complained good-naturedly about the amount of wedding talk in the house. My mother shooed him away from the cooling rack of cookies. My father turned on the living room lamps as the sky outside darkened gradually, one shade at a time. The house filled with the soft, comfortable sounds of people who know one another well. Later, after the dishes were washed and stacked, and my mother declared herself temporarily retired from the kitchen, I slipped upstairs to my room to change for dinner with Scott. The house felt quieter then, the holiday music off, replaced by the gentle background noise of the television downstairs and the occasional muffled conversation. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and just breathed. Inhale, exhale. The day replayed in small, vivid scenes, the bookstore, the warmth of Scott's hand, my mother's words about choices, the easy banter at breakfast. None of it answered the question of what future I would choose, but it all filled in parts of the picture I had left blank the first time. I changed into a simple dress and a warm cardigan, clothes that belonged to this time, this version of me. As I brushed my hair in front of the mirror, I caught my own gaze and held it. You don't have to decide everything tonight, I reminded myself quietly. Just be here. When Scott's car finally pulled up in front of the house, headlights sweeping across the front window, my heart skipped once, then settled into a steady beat. I grabbed my coat, called a quick goodbye down the stairs, and stepped out into the cold evening. The air had grown crisper, the sky deepening toward night.
A few early stars were visible, faint but determined. Scott waited by the passenger door, hands tucked into his pockets, breath visible in brief white bursts. "Hey," he said softly as I approached, "you look beautiful." "Hey," I replied, the word carrying more layers than the sound alone revealed. "You're on time. Miraculous."
"Hey, I can be responsible," he protested gently, "sometimes." He opened the car door for me, and as I slid into the seat, the familiar scent of his car, faint coffee, old upholstery, a hint of pine from an air freshener, wrapped around me. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt safe. We drove through the quiet streets toward a small restaurant on the edge of town, the kind of place where waitstaff knew customers by name. The heater hummed softly, filling the car with a steady warmth. Outside, Christmas lights on porches and lampposts blurred into gentle streaks of color as we passed. For a while, we didn't say much. The silence wasn't empty. It was easy, comfortable. I watched the world outside the window and listened to the sound of the tires on the road, the steady rhythm of the turn signal, the faint music playing from the radio. "How are you doing?" Scott asked eventually, eyes still on the road. Really seemed to be following me that day. "I'm thinking a lot," I admitted. "About the wedding?" he asked. "About everything," I said softly. "About the wedding, about the store, about what comes after." He nodded slowly, taking that in. "Is that scary or exciting?" he asked after a moment. "Both," I answered honestly. "I think it's always been both. I just never let myself say that out loud." Scott smiled a little, the corners of his mouth curling. "You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to be anything you are. I'd be more worried if you were just breezing through this like it was nothing." I let his words settle. There was a kind of relief in hearing that my mixed feelings didn't automatically disqualify me from being ready. At the restaurant, the lights were warm and low, the tables small and close together. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy in that way small-town places are when they lean into their own size instead of apologizing for it. The clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter created a gentle, human soundtrack. We were seated near a window where I could see tiny flakes beginning to drift lazily past the glass, the first hints of snow that might decide to stay. My shoulders relaxed as I listened to Scott talk about his day, customers who'd come in to buy gift cards, a shipment that had arrived late, the satisfaction of helping a kid find the next book in a series they loved. At one point, he paused and leaned his elbows on the table, looking at me with a thoughtful expression. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded. "Of course." "Are you happy? Here? With me? With all of this?" The question was simple, but it reached right down into the center of me. In 2004, I had framed my decision to leave as an escape. From a small town, from a future I hadn't fully examined, from a version of myself I thought would be too small. I had never really asked myself if I'd been happy then. I just assumed that bigger meant better, that more meant right. Now, sitting across from Scott in the glow of a small-town restaurant, I let myself actually feel the answer. "I'm more at peace than I expected to be," I said slowly. "I thought coming back here would feel like stepping backwards, like undoing everything, but it doesn't. It feels like another version of forward." He watched me, listening carefully. "And with you," I continued, my voice softer, "I'm safe? Seen? You make the world feel smaller in a good way, not a claustrophobic way." His expression gentled, and I saw a small hint of relief flicker through his eyes. "That's good," he said quietly. "Because I want you to be happy, Eve. I want us both to be happy. I don't want you to wake up in 10 years and feel like you settled for something you didn't really want." The irony of his words brushed against the edges of my awareness, like a distant bell ringing through fog. I had, in another future, convinced myself that staying would have been settling. Now he was the one afraid of becoming my compromise. "I don't want that either," I said.
That's why I'm really trying to pay attention right now." He smiled a little. "You were always thorough," he teased. As the evening went on, the conversation drifted to lighter things. Stories from our childhoods, inside jokes, shared memories that sparked small, warm bursts of laughter. My body felt relaxed, my mind gentler with itself. When we finally stepped back outside, the world had changed.
Snow was falling in earnest now. Soft, steady flakes descending from a sky that had turned deep and dark. The air felt quiet in that way it does when snow absorbs the usual sharp edges of sound. Streetlights cast cones of golden light where the flakes glittered briefly before settling. We stood for a moment on the sidewalk, watching. "It's like one of those cheesy holiday cards," Scott said, his breath visible in the cold. "Yeah," I replied softly, "the good kind." He looked at me, snowflakes catching in his hair, on his shoulders. "I love you, you know," he said simply. The words were familiar. It wasn't the first time he'd said them, but tonight they landed differently. They didn't feel like a demand or a claim. They felt like an offering. "I know," I said. "I love you too." The truth of it rang clear even through the layers of uncertainty about the future. Loving him and wanting more had never been mutually exclusive, I realized. I had only thought they were. On the drive home, the snow continued to fall, frosting the edges of the windshield, blurring the world into a soft, glowing haze. The heater hummed, our breaths fogged the air, and the radio murmured a quiet song I barely registered. When Scott pulled up in front of my house, he put the car in park, but didn't turn off the engine right away. We sat in the quiet for a moment, watching the snow. "You okay again?" he asked, gently. "Yeah," I said. "I'm tired, but in a good way. There's a lot in my head, but also a lot in my heart, I guess." He reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm and solid. "That's allowed," he said. "You can have both." I squeezed his hand back. "Good night," I said softly. "Good night, almost wife," he replied, smiling. Inside the house, the lights were dim, most rooms already dark. A lamp glowed in the living room where my father had fallen asleep in his chair, the television flickering quietly with some old black and white movie. I kissed his forehead gently, turned off the TV, and moved quietly upstairs. In my room, I changed into pajamas and slipped under the covers. The sheets were cool at first, then gradually warmed by my body. I lay on my back, staring at the faint shadows on the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around me. My mind drifted over the day, not in a frantic, anxious way, but like slowly turning pages in a book. The kitchen, the bookstore, Scott's hand in mine, my mother's words, the snow. I didn't have answers yet. I didn't know which version of my future I would wake up to eventually, but for the first time in a long time, I felt fully present inside my own life, not just performing it. My breathing slowed. Inhale, exhale. The mattress cradled me in its familiar, slightly uneven way. The faint smell of apples and cinnamon filtered in from downstairs. As my eyes grew heavy and sleep began to pull gently at the edges of my awareness, I thought of the star I had wished on in 2004 and of the strange kindness of being allowed to walk this path again. Not to fix everything, not to guarantee a particular outcome, but to see more clearly. With that thought floating softly through my mind, I let go and drifted into sleep. The quiet of the house wrapping around me like a blanket as the snow continued to fall, steady and soft, over Eastborough.
The next morning began with a list. Technically, it began with the sound of my alarm, an old, slightly kinny radio on my nightstand, clicking on, spilling soft music into the gray light of early day. For a moment, as I drifted up out of sleep, I forgot where I was. My body searched for the weight of my New York comforter, the distant hum of city traffic, the faint glow of high-rise windows. Instead, I felt the familiar dip of my childhood mattress and the coolness of air that had crept in around old window frames. The radio played a classic holiday song, the singer's voice gentle and a little scratchy. Somewhere downstairs, a cabinet door closed and the kettle began to whistle. I opened my eyes slowly and watched my breath fog faintly in the chill of the room. It wasn't really cold, just cooler than the constantly climate-controlled apartments I'd grown used to. I pulled the blanket up around my shoulders and lay there for a moment, letting my mind ease into the day rather than jumping straight into it. A list. That thought floated up gradually, like something written in pencil on the inside of my eyelids. Of course there would be a list. My mother expressed love in many ways. Food, hugs, worry. But lists were her second language. Weddings especially required them. There would be tasks, errands, final fittings, calls to make, people to confirm. I took a slow breath in, feeling the air fill my chest, and let it out, long and even. I could feel my body settling. No rush, no sprint, just the steady awareness that another day of this strange second chance was beginning, and all I had to do for now was put my feet on the floor. Downstairs, the kitchen was already awake. My mother stood at the table with a notepad in front of her, pen in hand, mouth pursed in concentration. Her robe was cinched tight, her hair pulled into a neat twist, as if she'd decided the day required a certain level of readiness before 7 in the morning. My father hovered near the counter, coffee mug in hand, peering curiously at her work. "Good morning," I said, stepping into the doorway. They both looked up, and there it was again, that immediate, unguarded warmth that rose in their faces at the sight of me. No matter how old I was, or what I had seen and done in the years ahead, in this house I was as loved and known as if I were still small. "Morning, honey," my mother said. "We were just talking about you." "Only good things. Mostly." My mother swatted his arm lightly with the back of her hand, but she smiled. "We've entered the official no more procrastinating phase of the week, so I'm making the list. You and I have a dress fitting at 11. The florist is dropping off the centerpieces tomorrow for you to approve. We need to stop by the church office to confirm the music, and your Aunt Linda keeps calling about the seating chart." "Of course she does," I murmured, moving toward the coffee pot. I poured myself a cup and inhaled the steam, feeling it warm the inside of my nose and throat. The mug was familiar in my hands, its weight grounding. I took a small sip and felt the gentle jolt of caffeine slide into my system, waking up the parts of my mind that still clung to sleep. Let's not forget you're supposed to remember to breathe occasionally. That's an important line item." "I'll pencil that in between try on dress and answer everyone's questions about my feelings," I replied dryly. But my tone was light. My mother's expression softened. "Hey," she said quietly, "this isn't an interrogation. We just care. And also, some of us are control enthusiasts." "You?" my father asked, feigning shock. "Never." She shot him a look that was half stern, half amused, then turned back to me. "Sometimes lists help when things feel big. You don't have to think about the whole mountain, just the next few steps." It was such a simple sentiment, but it landed inside me with a resonance I hadn't expected. In New York, the mountains had come in the form of campaigns and deadlines and promotions. I'd climbed them by breaking them into tasks, emails, decks, and meetings. Here, the mountain had a different shape. Weddings, futures, choices. But the principle wasn't so different. One step at a time. We went over the list together while we ate breakfast. Toast again, this time with jam, and scrambled eggs that tasted like every weekend morning of my childhood. My mother's handwriting filled the page in neat rows, each item carefully numbered. As she read them out loud, I felt something in me unclench, not because everything was under control, but because there was a structure, however simple, to the day. After breakfast, I slipped upstairs to get ready for the fitting. In my room, the dress hung from the closet door, swathed in a protective garment bag. For a moment, I just stood there, looking at it. The shape of it was vaguely familiar. Fitted bodice, gentle skirt, nothing extravagant. The girl who had first chosen it had wanted something beautiful, but not loud. Something that wouldn't overwhelm a small church or a small-town bride.
I unzipped the bag slowly. The fabric gleamed softly in the morning light, not harsh or flashy. Lace traced the neckline and sleeves in delicate patterns, not overly ornate, but intricate enough to feel special. I reached out and let my fingers rest lightly on it. It was cool to the touch, but it didn't feel remote. It felt reachable. As I stepped into the dress and pulled it gently up over my body, I could feel the difference between this moment and the first time I had done it. Back then, I had been full of nervous excitement and buried fear, telling myself I had to move forward or I would disappoint everyone. Now, I was still nervous, but my nervousness had a different flavor. It wasn't about failing a script. It was about wanting to be honest with myself and the people who loved me. My mother zipped the back carefully, her hand steady. "There," she said softly. "Look at you." I turned toward the mirror. The woman reflected back at me wore the same dress I remembered, but the eyes were not the same. There was more in them, more memories, more miles, more late nights in distant cities, more quiet moments in high-rise apartments, watching the world globe beneath my window. There were also more questions, but they felt less jagged now, more like open doors than looming cliffs. "You're beautiful," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. I smiled, a small, genuine curve of my mouth. "Thank you," I said. She fussed with the hem, tugging lightly, smoothing wrinkles that only she could see. As she moved around me, I watched her in the mirror too, her careful attention, the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was focused. I realized, with a soft pang, how much I had missed seeing her like this. "How do you feel?" she asked eventually, straightening up. I thought about it. Really thought. "I feel like myself," I said slowly, "just in a different context." Her smile widened, a little tear shining at the corner of her eye. "That's a good thing," she replied. "You want to bring yourself into a marriage, not some version of you that you think everyone expects." For a moment, I considered telling her everything, that I knew a version of the future where I never wore this dress down the aisle, where I left town the day after Christmas and didn't come back, where my life took a sharp, glittering turn that led me to a city and a job and a man she had never met. But the words felt too heavy for this small and bright room. And maybe, I thought, this wasn't about confessing some impossible time-bending truth. Maybe it was simply about showing up as honestly as I could now. We finished a fitting. The dress needed only tiny adjustments, easily handled. On the way home, we stopped at the church office where I listened to the organist talk about the music options, while my mind drifted gently between present and memory. The smell of old wood and wax in the sanctuary, the way the light came through the stained glass, the creak of pews as people shifted,
all of it felt like the inside of a story I'd once stepped out of before it was finished. In the afternoon, Mandy arrived. She burst through our front door with the same energy she had always had, coat unzipped, scarf half off, cheeks pink from the cold. "Mandy!" she called, her voice carrying up the stairs. "Where's my favorite bride, and why do I still not have access to the seating chart?" I met her halfway down the staircase. For a second, I just looked at her. Her hair was shorter than I remembered from my New York life, styled in a way that suited her face perfectly. She wore a sweater in a bright, unapologetic color and jeans tucked into boots dusted with snow. There was a familiar spark in her eyes, the one that said she was both ready to joke and ready to fight for me, depending on what the situation required. "Hi," I said, and something in my voice must have given me away because her expression softened almost immediately. "Uh-oh," she said, one eyebrow lifting. "That's the I've been thinking too much greeting." I laughed, a small, relieved sound. "You know me too well," I replied. "Obviously, it's been my full-time unpaid job since we were 8. We retreated to the living room with mugs of something warm, tea for her, cocoa for me, both topped with a small, indulgent swirl of whipped cream my mother insisted on. The tree in the corner glowed steadily, its ornaments collected over decades. The room felt cocooned, safe. Mandy tucked her feet under her on the couch and turned toward me. "Okay, talk. What's going on in that brilliant, overactive brain of yours?" I wrapped my hands around my mug, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. "I'm just thinking about choices, about how much a single decision can change the course of everything."
She nodded slowly, not yet filling in the blanks for me. "Do you ever wonder," I went on, "if there was a version of your life where you chose differently? A different school, a different job, a different person?" Mandy considered that, staring at the lights on the tree. "Sure," she said. "I think everybody does. But if I played that game too far, I'd drive myself crazy. I'd rather ask if I like who I'm becoming now. If I don't, then I figure I can still change my trajectory from here." I smiled faintly. "Always so sensible," I murmured. "Don't spread that around," she said. "I have a reputation to maintain." She studied me for a moment. "Is this about Scott?" she asked, gently. "Because if you tell me you don't want to do this, I will personally help you pack a bag and we will create a plan so efficient it will make your little project manager soul proud." The fact that she meant it, that even here, in this version of our lives, she would put my truth above the momentum of the wedding, made my throat tighten. "I don't know what I want yet," I admitted. "I just know more now than I did the first time. About myself. About what I thought I was giving up. About what I actually lost." She nodded. "Okay. So you're not on autopilot. That's good. Tell me something, though." Her eyes softened. "When you think about walking down that aisle toward him, does it feel like sacrifice, or does it feel like stepping into something?" The question sat quietly between us, not demanding an immediate answer. I closed my eyes for a moment and let myself really imagine it. The sanctuary, the music, the faces turned toward me. Scott at the front. In the version of the past I'd carried with me all those years, that aisle had felt like a tunnel narrowing around me, leading to an exit door I wasn't ready to go through. Now, with all I'd seen and lived, the image had shifted. It didn't feel simple or easy, but it also didn't feel like erasure. "It feels like a path," I said, slowly. "Not the only one, maybe, but not a trap, either." Mandy smiled. "That's something," she said. "You know, there isn't just one right life for you. You could live 100 different versions and still be you. Maybe this is just you checking the fit before you commit to a direction." I leaned back against the couch, feeling the cushions support my weight. The tension in my shoulders eased, my breathing deepened. I kept thinking about New York, about work, about another kind of future, But when I picture it now, it's not as shiny as it used to be. It's interesting, challenging, but also lonely. Mandy's gaze softened even further. You've always wanted big things, and I never want you to stop wanting them. But maybe the definition of big gets to change. Maybe a full, grounded life in a small town is big in its own way, if you're fully inside it. We fell into a comfortable silence then, sipping our drinks, watching the lights blink slowly on the tree. The house hummed softly around us, distant clinks from the kitchen, the faint sound of my father's footsteps upstairs, the wind brushing against the windows. Brother James did not appear, but I almost imagined him perched on the arm of a chair somewhere, listening to us and nodding in quiet approval. By the evening, the day's tasks had been checked off the list. The dress fitting was done. Calls had been made, details had been confirmed. Nothing earth-shattering had happened. There were no dramatic fights, no sudden revelations, just conversations, small adjustments, slow, steady noticing. And yet something in me had shifted again, almost imperceptibly. A little more space had opened up around my fear, a little more room for nuance. That night, as I lay in bed, the house settling into its familiar nighttime quiet, I listened to my own breathing. Inhale, exhale. The dark around me felt gentle, not suffocating. I thought of the life waiting for me in 2004, the one I had temporarily stepped away from. I thought of the life I might choose here with Scott and my family and this town. For the first time, I didn't pit them against each other like opponents. I simply held them both in my mind, like two different books on the same shelf, neither inherently better, just different stories I might inhabit. Sleep came gradually, like a soft tide rising. As it did, a quiet understanding settled over me. Whatever I chose in the days ahead, it wouldn't erase who I had been or who I might become. It would simply be one more step on a path that, either way, could still lead to a life where I was fully present, fully awake, fully myself. And in that realization, there was a calm so deep that it carried me gently into dreams, while outside the window, the winter night held the town in its quiet, steady embrace.
The morning of the rehearsal sneaked up on me more quietly than I expected. I woke to the soft, familiar hum of the house and a pale stripe of winter light leaning across my bedroom floor. For a few long breaths, I lay still and just listened, the heating vent ticking gently, a muffled door closing somewhere down the hall, the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. It felt like every other morning of my childhood, and not at all like the eve of a big practice run for a wedding. My wedding. Possibly. I turned onto my side and watched dust motes drifting lazily in the light. My body felt rested, pleasantly heavy against the mattress. My mind, for once, didn't feel like it had jolted straight into what now mode. Instead, thoughts arrived quietly, one by one, like guests coming through a door instead of a crowd pushing its way in. Rehearsal day, I reminded myself. Just rehearsal, not the mountain. One small step. I slid out of bed and felt the cool kiss of the floor under my feet. As I padded down the hall toward the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror on the wall. Hair a little messy, face soft from sleep, eyes holding both my 25-year-old reflection and the 33 years I carried inside. I smiled at myself, just a small curve of my lips. "We're still here," I murmured, "still doing this." Downstairs, my mother had already shifted into rehearsal mode. The kitchen table was covered in neatly arranged papers, copies of the program draft, notes about where people should stand, a little sketch of the church interior with tiny X's marking everyone's place. A pen sat in the center,
like a general ready to give instructions. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said without looking up, tapping the paper with her pen. "We need to leave by 10 if we want to be early. The pastor is very big on promptness." "Morning," I replied, moving toward the coffee. I wrapped my hands around the mug and took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread from my palms up into my chest. The act of drinking coffee at this old table felt like almost a grounding ritual, one I hadn't realized I missed until I had it back. As we ate breakfast, my mother talked through the plan in her gently efficient way. Who would walk in when, where the bridesmaids would stand, how we'd all exit. It should have felt overwhelming, but somehow it didn't. Maybe because I knew, now, that this wasn't a contract with the universe. It was just a practice for one possible version of the future. By the time we piled into the car to drive to the church, my body had settled into a calm readiness. Not excitement exactly, not dread, just a willingness to show up and see. The church looked the same as it always had. White siding, a small steeple, stained glass windows that caught what little winter light there was and turned it into gentle color inside. Snow from the last few days lay in soft heaps along the edges of the lawn, plowed into tidy mounds near the parking lot. The air was crisp as we stepped out of the car, our breaths puffing out in small clouds. Inside, the sanctuary greeted me with its familiar, faintly echoing quiet. Wooden pews lined the aisle, their surfaces polished smooth by decades of use. The center aisles stretched ahead, carpeted in red, leading to the simple altar at the front. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting patches of muted color on the floor. The air smelled faintly of wax, old wood, and something floral that lingered from last Sunday's arrangements. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting the space settle around me. In another life, this aisle was the path I almost walked, but ultimately didn't, leaving behind a dress, a bouquet, a town, and a man at the front who had loved me enough to let me go, even while it hurt. I had carried the ghost of that unwalked path with me for 8 years. Now I was back at the starting line. "You okay?" a voice murmured beside me. I turned. Scott had just come in from the side entrance, shaking a bit of snow from his hair. He wore a simple sweater and slacks, nothing dramatic, but he looked solid, present, the kind of person who shows up when he says he will. "I'm here," I replied. "That's a start." He smiled softly. "It's more than a start. It's kind of the whole point." People began to filter in then. Bridesmaids, groomsmen, my brother, a couple of relatives, the pastor. The sanctuary filled with low conversation and the shuffle of footsteps. Coats were draped over pews, programs pointed at, jokes made about who would absolutely trip over whose train if they weren't careful. The pastor, a kind, mild-mannered man with laugh lines around his eyes, gathered us all at the front.
"All right," he said. "We're just walking through it today. No pressure. This is about getting comfortable, so tomorrow feels like a celebration, not a performance." His words should have calmed me, and in a way they did. But as he outlined the basic flow, my eyes kept drifting to the back of the sanctuary, to the door I'd be walking through, to the length of the aisle that seemed, in that moment, longer than I remembered. "Let's start with the procession," he said. "Everyone find your places, as if we're about to begin." People moved into position. Scott took his place at the front, beside the pastor. The wedding parties scattered to their starting points. My father joined me near the back, offering his arm. "You ready, kiddo?" he asked, his voice soft enough that only I could hear.
I paused, searching for the truest word. I'm present, he chuckled quietly. That's more than some people manage on their wedding day, he said. As the music started, a simple, familiar melody played softly on the piano. I felt my heart beat a little faster, but not painfully so. My breathing remained steady, in and out, like waves against a quiet shore. We didn't take a step. Something shimmered at the edge of my vision. When I turned my head slightly, there he was, leaning casually against the far wall of the sanctuary, near a stained glass window. Brother James, arms crossed, expression somewhere between amused and deeply, almost painfully kind. He caught my eye and tilted his head toward the aisle, as if to say, "Well, what do you see?" I let my gaze drift down the length of the red carpet. The first time around, my original 1996, I hadn't really looked, not like this. I'd been moving too fast, too afraid to stand still long enough to feel anything clearly. I'd let momentum carry me to the edge and then yanked myself away. Now, with the strange knowledge of 2004 folded into my bones, I allowed myself to really see it. It wasn't just an aisle. It was a path lined with people who loved me. Parents, brother, friends, neighbors who had watched me grow up. At the far end stood a man who had rearranged his entire life to keep a small, beloved store open because it mattered to him, because stories mattered to him, because I mattered to him. The aisle did not feel like a tunnel. It felt like an option. From his spot by the window, Brother James lifted his eyebrows slightly. No pressure, his posture seemed to say. Just notice. We took one step. My hand tightened very slightly on my father's arm, and he patted my fingers in a small, reassuring rhythm. The music continued, gentle and unhurried. My feet moved slowly, the carpet soft under my shoes. Each step felt deliberate, chosen. At about halfway, the pastor called out, "Pause there a moment, so everyone can get a sense of the timing." We stopped. The sanctuary hushed, the music fading for a moment. I stood with my father beside me, the wedding party ahead, Scott at the front. The late morning light spilled across the aisle, staining the red carpet with patches of blue and gold from the windows. From the corner of my eye, I saw Brother James uncross his arms. "How does it feel?" his voice murmured, though his lips didn't move. It was like hearing someone from the next seat over in a movie theater. I didn't answer out loud. Instead, I took a slow breath in and out and did a quiet inventory of my body. My heart was beating, yes, but not in that panicked, trapped way I remembered. It felt alive, aware, but not desperate to escape. My palms weren't sweating, my chest didn't feel tight. If anything, there was a strange calm underneath the nerves, like standing on solid ground and just knowing that I was allowed to move or stay as I chose. "I feel like a choice," I thought quietly, directing the answer toward wherever he was listening. There was the faintest sense of approval, like a nod you catch in your peripheral vision. That's all it ever was, his voice seemed to say. You just couldn't see it back then. The rehearsal went on. We walked the rest of the aisle. There was the handoff, my father's warm fingers pressing mine into Scott's slightly shaky ones. We stood at the front while the pastor talked through the movements we'd make tomorrow, when to turn, where to look, how not to knock over the candles. The wedding party joked quietly during breaks. My mother dabbed at her eyes once or twice, even though it wasn't the real thing yet. Through it all, I felt present.
Not swept away, not numb, just here. Afterward, as people drifted back into their coats and boots, Scott and I lingered in the quiet sanctuary for a moment. He stood beside me near the altar, hands in his pockets, looking down the aisle we'd just walked. "So," he said softly, "how was that for you?" I considered my answer. "A little surreal," I admitted, "but also less scary than I thought it would be."
He glanced at me, his expression open, vulnerable. "That's good," he said. "I don't want this to be scary for you. Big, yes. Important, sure, but not something you're trying to survive." "I'm not trying to survive it," I said. "I'm trying to understand it." He smiled a little. "You always were the girl who had to understand everything." "Occupational hazard," I replied. We stood there quietly for a few breaths, staring down the aisle. The sanctuary felt even stiller now that everyone else had left. The distant ticking of the building's old heating system echoed softly. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Always," he replied. "Why are you so sure about this, about me, about us?" He didn't rush his answer. He shifted his weight slightly, thinking. "I'm not sure in a magical, never doubt anything way. Sometimes I lie awake at night worrying about the store, about money, about being enough for you. But when I picture my life 10, 20 years from now, the one thing that feels right every time is you in it, not as an accessory or an extra, but as my person, the one I come home to, the one I share stupid jokes with at the end of the day, the one who tells me when I'm being an idiot and still holds my hand anyway." His words weren't poetic. They weren't grand, but their simplicity sank into me like a stone dropping gently into deep water. In 2004, I had fallen into something that looked like love, but came with conditions and secrecy and compartments. Listening to Scott now, in this small church with its simple windows and worn pews, I felt the weight of the difference. Love that expects you to fit a shape and love that expects you to keep being fully alive are not the same thing. We left the church shortly after, stepping back into the cold, clear air. My parents were waiting by the car, talking with the pastor. Snow still covered the ground, but the sky had brightened into a pale blue that promised a gentle, clear evening. As we drove home, my father hummed along with a song on the radio. My mother made a few more small adjustments to her list, and I leaned my head against the window, watching the world slide by. Brother James appeared again that night. I was in my room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, with a notebook open in front of me. I'd started to write down little pieces of the day, not as a formal journal exactly, but as a way of anchoring my thoughts. Phrases like, "Aisle feels like choice," and "love equals growing, not freezing," dotted the page in my uneven handwriting. "You always were a note-taker," came his voice from the corner. I looked up. He sat in my desk chair, spinning it slowly side to side with one foot on the floor. The posture was casual, but there was something intent in his gaze. "Big day," he said, "for a rehearsal." I closed the notebook gently. It felt like reframing, like I've been carrying around this story about what this week meant, and now I'm seeing that I only ever read the first draft. He nodded, clearly pleased. "That's kind of the point. You didn't come back here to cosplay as your 25-year-old self. You came back to bring your 33-year-old awareness into these rooms and see what changes."
"Will it change anything in 2004? I asked quietly. "If I choose differently now, or even if I don't?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's the part everyone always wants to know," he said. "The guarantee. The promise that if you pick the right door, the rest of the house will magically rearrange itself into perfection." He shook his head gently. "Life doesn't work that way, Eve," he went on. "You know that. You've seen enough to know. There will always be unexpected turns, losses, surprises, joys. You can't control the whole map. What you can do is choose the next step in front of you with as much honesty and presence as you can muster." "So this might not fix anything?" I asked. "This isn't about fixing. This is about understanding, about softening, about giving yourself the gift of not spending the next 20 years
punishing yourself for a decision you made without all the information. Whatever you walk back to, you'll carry that understanding with you. And that, believe it or not, changes more than you think. His words settled slowly, like snowflakes, landing one by one. So, he added, tilting his head, what did you see today? I thought of the aisle, of my father's arm, of the faces in the pews, of Scott's steady presence and simple words, of my own heartbeat, faster than usual, but not wild with fear. I saw that staying isn't the same as shrinking, and that leaving doesn't automatically equal growing. It's more complicated than that. A small, proud smile appeared on his face. Now we're getting somewhere, he said. What should I do? I asked him, even though I knew he'd dodge the question. He didn't disappoint. I'm not your decision maker, he said. I'm just here to hold up a few mirrors and maybe crack a joke or two so you don't take yourself too seriously. You already know more than you think you do, and tomorrow you'll know more than you know tonight. Let it come. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Are you going to be there at the ceremony? If I go through with it? He chuckled softly. Front row seat, perks of the job. My eyelids grew heavier as we talked, my body relaxing slowly into the mattress. The room felt safe, familiar. My breathing slowed, each inhale and exhale smoothing out the edges of my thoughts. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized something gentle and important. No matter what I chose, whether I walked down that aisle in a dress and said vows, or whether I stepped aside again with a clearer heart, this experience had already begun to heal something in me. The part that believed I had ruined everything beyond repair. The part that thought there was only one shot at getting it right. Hey, Brother James, I murmured, eyes half closed. Yeah? His voice replied, already sounding a bit farther away. Thank you, I said simply. There was a pause, and then his answer, soft and almost fond. Sleep, Dave. Big day tomorrow, whatever kind of day it turns out to be. With that, the room grew very quiet. The house settled around me, the winter night laying its calm hand over the town. My last waking breath left my lungs slowly, and as I slipped fully into sleep, the image of the aisle blurred gently into the image of a star over a city skyline, both paths glowing softly, both still waiting to see which one I would step onto next.
The morning of the wedding dawned softer than I remembered. Light seeped slowly into my room, turning the edges of the curtains a pale, glowing gray. For a while, I lay on my back and listened to the house come to life around me. Somewhere down the hall, pipes murmured as someone turned on the shower. Floorboards creaked lightly under familiar footsteps. From downstairs, the faint rattle of pans and the low murmur of voices reached my ears. I focused on my breathing. Inhale, exhale, letting each breath stretch a little longer than the last. My body felt simultaneously heavy and light, as if I were both sinking into the mattress and hovering just above myself. A part of me wanted to hold very still, to keep this day from actually beginning. Another part of me was quietly ready to see what would happen when it did. This was the day I hadn't reached the first time. In the original version of my past, I had never stood in front of a congregation in a white dress, never spoken vows, never heard the official words pronounced over us. I had made my escape before we got that far. The Eve who left for New York had carried that fact like a knot in her chest, part relief, part shame, part unfinished sentence. Now, somehow, the sentence had reappeared on the page and I'd been given the option to keep writing. I sat up slowly, feeling the cool air graze my arms as the blankets slipped down. My heart beat steadily, not racing, not sluggish, alert, but not frantic. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, let my feet rest on the floor for a moment, and then stood. At the mirror, I studied my face in the soft morning light. There were no lines yet, no physical signs of the 8 extra years I carried inside. But my eyes knew. They held New York's reflections alongside Eastborough's. City lights layered over small-town Christmas decorations, a high-rise window layered over this bedroom's simple curtains. Whatever happens today, you're allowed to be honest with yourself, I told my reflection quietly. The house was already buzzing when I went downstairs. My mother moved through the kitchen with purposeful grace, dressed in a neat blouse and skirt, hair pinned up more carefully than usual. The smell of coffee mingled with something sweet, cinnamon rolls maybe, or the last batch of cookies. My father wore a pressed shirt and a slightly overwhelmed expression, as if he still couldn't quite believe we'd reached this day. "There she is," he said, his face softening into a smile. "The star of the show." My mother turned, and her eyes filled instantly. "Oh, honey," she said, stepping forward to hug me. "How are you feeling?" I let myself sink into her arms for a moment, feeling the warmth of her embrace, the steady rise and fall of her breath. I was not the girl who had run from this day without saying goodbye. I was not the woman in New York who'd convinced herself she didn't need this kind of closeness. I was something in between. "Nervous," I answered truthfully, "but I'm here." She held me at arm's length and studied my face as if searching for cracks. That's all we can ask, one step at a time. As we ate breakfast, light but comforting, fruit and toast and scrambled eggs, my mother checked her watch periodically, ticking off invisible boxes in her mind. My father tried to cut the tension with small jokes. Evan shuffled in eventually, hair rumpled, muttered something that sounded like "congrats," and then hugged me quickly on his way to the fridge. Time, like everything else that day, moved gently but firmly forward. By late morning, the living room had transformed into a makeshift dressing area. My dress hung in the center, its soft fabric catching the light. My shoes waited by the coffee table, more practical than princess-like, chosen with the knowledge that my feet and I had years of walking ahead of us. Mandy arrived armed with a small makeup bag and an energy that vibrated just below the surface. "Okay, today's agenda: you breathe, I help, and we don't let anyone talk you into anything that doesn't feel like you." She said it like a joke, but I knew she meant every word. As she helped me with my hair and makeup, we talked about small things, the songs on the radio, a memory of a disastrous middle school dance, a teacher we'd both had. The normalcy of it calmed me. The way her hands moved confidently, brushing powder here, smoothing hair there, made me feel less like I was being prepared and more like I was being supported. At one point, she caught my eyes in the mirror. "Last check-in," she said quietly. "If you say the word, we call a timeout. No judgment, no drama, just options." I let the weight of that sink in. The old Eve believed the wedding was a conveyor belt she couldn't step off without wrecking everything. The Eve from 2004 believed leaving was the only way to save herself from being trapped. This Eve, the Eve sitting in front of the mirror with her best friend behind her, knew something new. There were choices all along, and they didn't have to be violent to be real. "I'm not running," I said softly. Not today. If I leave, it'll be through the front door with my head up, not out the back with a suitcase and a plane ticket." Mandy nodded, satisfied.
"Okay then," she said. "Let's make sure you recognize yourself when you look in that mirror." When the dress was on and the final adjustments made, I stood in the middle of the room and took a slow, deliberate breath. The fabric rested gently over my body, not constricting, not heavy. My hair felt secure, but not shellacked into submission. My makeup looked like an echo of my own face, not a mask. My mother's eyes filled again when she saw me. "You look beautiful," she whispered. My father, hovering in the doorway, cleared his throat. "You sure you're ready for this?" he asked. Not in a challenging way, but in a "I will back you no matter what" way. I met his gaze and found in his eyes the same offer Mandy had made. I was not being carried by other people's expectations. I was being accompanied by other people's love. "I'm ready to walk into the moment," I said. "We'll see what happens from there." The drive to the church passed in a kind of quiet cocoon. Snow still lined the streets, though the sky was bright and clear. People walked along the sidewalks in their winter coats, carrying packages, holding hands, living their ordinary lives on what felt like the most extraordinary, ordinary day of mine. I watched the town slide by through the car window, storefronts, the park, the turn toward the church, and felt a deep, steady awareness of where I was and who I was with. At the church, everything moved in gentle, well-meaning motions. Guests arrived, their footsteps echoing in the narthex. Coats were shrugged off, hushed conversations floated, programs rustled. The organ warmed the air, playing quiet prelude pieces. In a small side room, I waited with my mother, Mandy, and a couple of bridesmaids. The air smelled faintly of perfume and flowers, the bouquets arranged in a corner like a small forest of white and green. Every so often someone would peek in, my father, the pastor, an usher, to check on timing. Each time, I became more aware of my breathing, keeping it slow, steady. I felt my heart, yes, but it wasn't pounding against the walls of my chest in protest. It felt like a drum keeping time, reminding me I was here, alive, awake. Brother James appeared in the far corner of the room, like he'd been there all along. He leaned casually against a bookcase, arms folded, one ankle crossed over the other. "Well," he said quietly, his eyes warm with something close to pride. "Look at you." I glanced around. No one else seemed to notice him. Mandy was fussing with a bobby pin. My mother was checking her watch again. This conversation, like so many with him, existed in a gently separate layer. "How do you feel?" he asked. I took a moment to answer honestly. "Not certain, but not trapped." He nodded, as if that was exactly the combination he'd hoped for. You don't have to be certain to be sincere. Certainty is overrated anyway. Honestly showing up is the better trick. "Is this the part where you tell me what to do?" I knew the answer. He smiled. "Nope," he said. "This is the part where I remind you that both staying and leaving are real choices, and neither one erases your worth. You're not a better or worse person depending on which you pick. You're just you,
on different paths. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten slightly. What happens to 2004 me if I marry him? Do I just wake up in a different life, a different city, no city at all? Not how it works, he said gently. You don't get to see that answer in advance, but you do bring this experience back with you, one way or another. You bring the knowledge that you were never as powerless as you believed. The pastor knocked softly on the door then, his voice muffled. 5 minutes, he called. 5 minutes, my mother echoed, a mixture of excitement and nerves in her tone. Brother James straightened up. Time's up for rehearsal, he said quietly. This is the live show. Remember, no decision you make from a place of presence and honesty is a failure. Stay, leave. Choose, he replied simply, and know that you're still loved on either side. Then he was gone.
When my father came to walk me to the back of the sanctuary, his eyes were shiny, but his smile was steady. Last chance to elope to Canada, he joked softly. I hear it's cold there, I replied. I didn't pack for it. He chuckled and offered me his arm. I took it, feeling the familiar strength, the unspoken promise that he would walk with me as far as I needed him to, and not a step farther than I wanted. We stood at the closed doors as the music changed. Inside the sanctuary, people rose to their feet. The organ swelled gently into the chosen processional. The doors opened, and the aisle lay before me, lined with faces, filled with light. I took one slow breath. Step. The carpet was soft beneath my shoes. The air felt warm against my face. I became aware of small details, the way sunlight slanted through the windows, the way a child in the third pew craned their neck to see me better, the way Mandy's encouraging smile waited near the front. Step. I let my gaze move to Scott. He stood at the far end of the aisle, hands clasped in front of him, shoulders just a little tense. His expression was open, hopeful, a little scared, not because he doubted me, but because this was big for him too. He wasn't a symbol of small-town stasis or an obstacle to my ambition. He was a real, imperfect man who loved me and was willing to build a life with me, one book, one bill, one quiet evening at a time. Step. The knot I'd carried for 8 years began to loosen, not because I had already chosen, but because I finally understood something fundamental. I had always had a say. I had always been allowed to stop, to question, to pause, to speak. Step. Halfway down, I felt my father squeeze my hand gently. "You doing okay?" he murmured. I nodded, my eyes forward. "I'm here," I said. "Really here." He let out a small breath I don't think he realized he'd been holding. At the front, we reached the spot where he was meant to hand me over. The pastor's words floated around us like a gentle script we'd all agreed to follow. My father turned to me, kissed my forehead, and then placed my hand in Scott's. Scott's fingers closed around mine, warm, a little shaky. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi," I whispered back. We turned to face the pastor together. As the ceremony began, I listened more closely than I had the first time around, not just to the words, but to my own heart. The talk of promises, of seasons, of walking through both ease and difficulty together. In another life, those lines sounded like bars on a cage. Now they sounded like something more open-ended, a path that neither guaranteed nor demanded perfection, only presence. When it came time for the vows, the pastor nodded to us. "You may speak the traditional vows, or you may share your own." We had written our own in the original timeline. At least we had planned to try. This time, with everything I knew, I'd been quiet about it, unsure if I could say anything that didn't feel like pretending. Now, standing there with all those eyes on us and only Scott's face really in focus, I realized the only thing I could do was tell the truth. "You first?" he asked softly. I nodded. For a moment, I just breathed. Inhale, exhale. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel hostile. It felt expectant, like a blank page. "Scott, when we got engaged, I thought the only way to be a good partner was to be absolutely certain all the time. I thought fear meant I was making a mistake, so I buried it. I tried to force myself into one story of what my life was supposed to look like, and I didn't give myself room to ask questions." A murmur went through the crowd, but I kept my focus on his eyes. "The truth," I said, "is that I have wanted more than one thing. I've wanted you, and I've wanted big, bright, impossible cities. I've wanted this bookstore life, and I wanted the challenge and thrill of work
somewhere far away. For a long time, I believed that wanting more than one thing made me unfit for all of them. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but my voice stayed calm. "What I know now," I continued, "is that love is not about eliminating every other version of yourself. It's about choosing, every day, to bring your full self to another person and to let them do the same. If I marry you, it won't be because I've convinced myself there were no other options. It will be because, knowing I could have lived other lives, I still want to stand next to you in this one." I took a slow breath. "I can't promise I'll never doubt or never miss what I didn't choose," I said, "but I can promise to tell you the truth about it and to keep choosing you on purpose if this is the path we walk together. I can promise to respect your dreams the way I ask you to respect mine. And I can promise that if we ever feel lost, I will sit down with you, breathe, and figure out our next step, one at a time, the way we always have." The quiet in the room was deep, not heavy, just attentive. Scott squeezed my hand, eyes shining. Then he spoke, his voice gentle. "Eve, I fell in love with you long before we talked about rings or weddings. I fell in love with how your mind works, how you see possibilities where other people just see problems, how you light up when you talk about ideas. I know that saying yes to me means saying no to some other things,
and I never want you to pretend otherwise just to make me comfortable." He took a breath. "If you marry me, I don't want you to be the version of you who settled or shrank. I want you to be the version who knows she could have walked out of this town and never looked back, and chose not to, because building a life here with me felt big enough, rich enough, and real enough. I can't promise I won't get scared when it's hard. I can't promise the store will always be okay, but I can promise to keep showing up with you, to keep telling you the truth, and to never hold your love for the wider world against you." He smiled then, a little unsteady. "If someday you look at me and say, 'I need more than this,' I promise I won't call you selfish. I'll call you honest, and we'll face that together too." The pastor's voice came back into focus. "Do you, Eve, take?" The traditional words followed, and when the moment came to answer, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't being asked for an eternal guarantee. I was being asked for a sincere yes in this moment, with the understanding that the rest of our lives would be built one moment at a time. "I do," I said softly. When it was his turn, his voice didn't shake at all. "I do," he said. It was done, and also not done at all. It was just the beginning of whatever this path would hold. As we turned to face the congregation, as people clapped and smiled and dabbed at their eyes, I briefly thought of 2004, of my high-rise apartment, of the star outside my window, of the version of me that would eventually wake up there. I didn't know yet what this choice or the act of making it would mean for her, but I knew this much. Whichever life I opened my eyes into next, I would no longer carry the story that I had been a coward who ran solely because love was too small for me. I would know that love here was real, that staying could have been a brave choice too. Brother James was nowhere to be seen in the crowd, but somehow I could feel his presence. Satisfied, maybe even a little moved. As we walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, the music swelled, and the faces around us blurred. My body felt warm and grounded, each step a gentle landing. My heart didn't feel trapped. It felt open, unsure of the map maybe, but sure of its own capacity to keep learning. Outside the church, the winter air greeted us with a crisp, bright clarity. Someone rang the bells. Someone else threw a handful of white confetti that fell like tiny snowflakes around us. Scott laughed, and I did too, the sound floating up into the cold sky. For now, in this story, I had chosen to stay. Somewhere in another story, another version of me was still standing at a window in New York, looking up at a star. Soon enough, these timelines would have to reconcile, or I would wake up and find out that this had all been a long, luminous dream meant to soften the sharp edges of the past. But tonight, as the days stretched ahead into a small-town reception, into dancing and pie and toasts and tired, happy feet, there was only this, the feeling of his hand in mine, the gentle quiet at the center of my chest, and the deep, steady knowledge that whatever came next, I had finally met my own life with my eyes open.
The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the heavy, echoing quiet of my New York apartment, where the silence always seemed to wait for me to fill it with work or television or carefully timed calls. This was a softer quiet, the kind that lives in the corners of old houses on slow mornings, threaded through with faint, familiar sounds. I lay very still for a moment,
and let myself listen. Somewhere downstairs, a chair scraped lightly across the kitchen floor. A cabinet door closed with a gentle thud. The faint clink of dishes and the low hum of my parents' voices drifted up the staircase, wrapped in the comfort of routine. The heater murmured through the vents. Outside, a car passed by on the street, its tires whispering over packed snow. I breathed in slowly, feeling my chest rise, then exhaled just as slowly. My body felt warm under the blankets, pleasantly anchored by the shape of the mattress beneath me. For a few seconds, I let my mind float in the space between sleep and waking, where the lines between lives can blur. I'm married, I thought. The words arrived without fanfare. Simple and undeniable. I rolled them around in my mind, testing their weight. They didn't land with the thud of a sentence. They settled more like a blanket, something I could adjust, live inside, move with. I turned my head on the pillow and caught a glimpse of my hand resting near my face. The ring was there. Simple, modest, catching the morning light in a quiet way. I lifted my hand, watched it glint gently, then let it fall back to the mattress. The band felt neither foreign nor entirely familiar yet. It was a new sentence in a story I was still learning to read. I half expected to wake up in New York. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a part of me had always assumed that this stepping back into 1996, this second chance, this wedding I had never actually lived, might vanish as soon as a major turning point was reached. That I would open my eyes to the low hum of city traffic, the shape of my sleek furniture, the blinking light of a digital clock in 2004, carrying only a hazy memory of what had happened. But the ceiling above me was still the same slightly uneven one I'd stared at as a teenager. The tiny crack near the light fixture still traced its lazy path across the plaster. The air still held the faint scent of detergent and old books, and something sweet from the kitchen. I was still here. I sat up slowly, letting the blanket slide down to my waist. The room greeted me with its familiar, mismatched furniture, its bulletin board crowded with photos, its bookshelf bowed under the weight of too many paperbacks. My dress, now neatly rehung in its garment bag, fluttered slightly in a draft from the window. Pieces of yesterday drifted back to me, not as a blur, but as clear, distinct scenes. My father's arm under my hand as we walked down the aisle. The feel of the carpet yielding gently beneath each step. The way the light from the stained glass had pooled on the floor. Scott's face as I spoke my vows, open, vulnerable, steady. The sound of our voices saying "I do," not as a spell to lock in perfection, but as a sincere agreement to walk forward together, knowing uncertainty would come. The reception afterward, too, arrived in fragments. Laughter echoing in the church hall, the clink of forks on plates, my mother's emotional speech that turned halfway through into a story about my disastrous middle school perm. Evan pretending not to care, and then hugging me so hard I almost lost my balance. Mandy raising a glass and toasting not just our marriage, but Eve's decision to actually show up fully to her own life. Dancing to songs we'd picked more for sentiment than style, Scott's hand at the small of my back guiding me in an uneven but heartfelt attempt at a slow waltz. The feeling of my shoes coming off near the end of the night, my stocking feet grateful for the coolness of the floor. It had not been a perfect day. Nothing cinematic had happened. The cage had leaned slightly to one side. One of the flower arrangements had lost a handful of petals at the wrong moment. My veil had snagged briefly on a pew. But the imperfections hadn't felt like omens. They just felt human. And now the sun was up on the morning after. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and placed my feet on the floor. The wood was cool, but not shockingly so. As I stood, my body told me the quiet truth. I was a little tired. My muscles held the memory of dancing and standing, but there was no heaviness of regret pressing on my chest.
I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back a few inches. Outside, the world was clean and pale. A thin layer of new snow had fallen overnight, smoothing edges, softening lines. Our street looked like a postcard. House roofs lightly dusted, trees traced in white, the sky a soft winter blue. A neighbor scraped their sidewalk in slow, measured strokes. A dog trotted along beside its owner, leaving tidy prints in the snow. I rested my forehead lightly against the cool glass and closed my eyes for a moment. What happens now? I asked myself, not in a panicked way, just with quiet curiosity. In the original version of my life, this morning had been spent packing a suitcase, boarding a plane, stepping into an internship that would define the next 8 years. I had imagined that leaving as a clean break, an escape hatch I'd pulled just in time.
Now, that particular morning had been replaced by this one. I was no longer standing on the threshold of a plane. I was standing in my childhood bedroom, in a town that knew my name, with a ring on my finger, and the memory of vows spoken less than 24 hours ago. And somewhere, in a timeline I couldn't see yet, a 33-year-old woman in New York lay sleeping, waiting to find out whether this detour through the past would leave fingerprints on her life. A soft knock sounded on my door. "Honey?" my mother's voice came, gentle. "You up?" "Yeah," I said. "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside, carrying a small tray with a mug and a plate on it. Her hair was pulled back into a quick, imperfect bun, and she wore a sweater I recognized from years of winter mornings. Her eyes looked a little tired, but in the contented way of someone who has hosted much and survived it. "I figured the bride deserved room service at least once," she said, setting the tray on my nightstand. Steam curled up from the mug, coffee, the familiar scent rich and comforting. On the plate sat a slice of leftover pie, the crust slightly softened but still holding its shape. "Thanks," I said, my voice catching a little more than I expected. She sat on the edge of the bed and studied me for a moment. "How are you?" she asked. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my fingers. "Strangely peaceful," I said, not because I think I know exactly what comes next. I don't. But because I don't feel like I ran away from myself this time. Her eyes softened. "You looked
very present yesterday," she said, "like you weren't just going through the motions. That's all a mother can really hope for." We talked for a few minutes about small, practical things, the gifts on the dining table that would need to be sorted, the last of the food that needed to be shared with neighbors, the fact that the house might, for once, have a quiet evening ahead. "And Scott?" she asked lightly. "How's our new son-in-law this morning?" I smiled, a soft, almost shy expression. "I don't know yet," I said. "I haven't seen him this morning." But even as I said it, I knew that would change soon. There were plans, tentative but real, conversations about where we'd live, how we'd share time between my parents' house and his small apartment for a while, what we'd do about the store, whether I might take on some work there for a bit while I figured out what my own path looked like in this version of my life. My mother patted my leg gently and stood. "Take your time," she said. "No one's rushing you anywhere today." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and I sat for a few breaths longer, sipping coffee, tasting pie, letting my body fully wake up. When I finally dressed and went downstairs, the house was quieter than it had been in days. No flurry of wedding preparations, no stacks of pans and trays, just my father at the kitchen table with a crossword, my mother rinsing a few dishes at the sink, the radio murmuring softly in the background. "Morning, Mrs. Gustafson," he said with a little smile. I paused, feeling the name settle over me. It fit, and yet it didn't erase the other names I'd worn in my mind. It was one more layer, one more narrative, one more version of myself. "Still getting used to that," I admitted. "It'll roll off the tongue eventually," he said. After a while, the phone rang. My mother answered, and her face lit up. "Here she is," she said after a moment, handing me the receiver. "Your husband." The word landed softer than I expected. "Hey," I said, pressing the phone to my ear. "Hey, wife," came Scott's voice, warm and a little husky with sleep. "How's day one treating you?" I smiled, feeling the sound more than hearing it. "Gentle," I said. "So far, so good. Can I steal you for a walk? Nothing dramatic, just you, me, and some snow that hasn't decided what story it's in yet."
"Give me 15 minutes, I said. When I opened the front door a short time later, the winter air greeted me with a cool, clean touch. The sky had brightened into a clear, pale blue. Scott stood at the bottom of the steps, hands in his coat pockets, cheeks flushed from the cold. He looked up when he heard the door and broke into a smile that reached his eyes. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I replied, slipping my gloves on. We started walking with no particular destination in mind, just letting our feet choose the route. The snow crunched softly under our boots. Our breaths formed small clouds in front of us. The town around us seemed to be in its own slow recovery from the festivities. Trash cans half full of party remnants, a few wreaths slightly askew, twinkling lights still glowing on porches, though it was full daylight. For a while, we didn't talk. Our shoulders brushed occasionally. It was a quiet kind of intimacy, free from the swirling energy of the day before. "How are you?" he asked eventually. I thought about the question, then laughed softly. "I feel like I'm standing in the doorway between two rooms. In one room, there's the life I already lived, New York, work, a Christmas Eve 8 years from now where I'm alone in an apartment, wondering what I did with my heart. In the other room, there's this, Eastborough, the store, you, family dinners, snowstorms that shut everything down. And right now, I'm just here, in the doorway, not being pushed either way."
He nodded, taking that in. And if you had to pick a room, he asked gently. I already picked one, I said, looking down at the ring on my hand. At least for now. For now? He echoed, not accusingly, just curiously. I don't mean that like an expiration date. I mean, for this moment, I've said yes to this life, fully, on purpose, not as a consolation prize, not because I think it's the only one I could have had, but because I believe I can be fully myself here, with you. He walked a few steps in silence, then nodded. That's all I ever wanted. Not to be your only option, just to be the one you chose with your eyes open. We reached the park at the edge of town, the same park where we'd once sat on an old bench dreaming about our future. The bench was still there, dusted with snow. We brushed it off with gloved hands and sat, shoulders touching. The world around us was very still, snow-muffled, sky-wide. I don't know what this means for other timelines, I said softly, surprised to hear myself say it almost out loud. For other timelines? He echoed with a half-smile. I caught myself and chuckled, deflecting. I just mean, for the version of me that left, in my head, in my story, the one that's been carrying this week around like a weight. He nodded slowly. Maybe, he said, it means she gets to stop punishing herself. The simplicity of that hit me like a soft wave. Maybe, I agreed. We sat in silence for a while longer, watching a pair of kids in the distance try to roll a small snowball into something big enough to call a snowman. Their laughter carried faintly on the cold air. I don't know exactly what our life is going to look like, I said eventually. I don't know if the store will make it, or if I'll find a way to use my work brain here, or if we'll ever leave Eastborough, or if we'll stay forever. I don't know if we'll be happy all the time. We probably won't, Scott nodded. Probably not. For one thing, I snore. I laughed quietly. But, I continued, I know this. Yesterday, when I had every emotional reason to run, I didn't. Not because I was too scared to leave, but because I was no longer too scared to stay. That has to count for something. He slid his gloved hand over mine on the bench, fingers curling gently. It does, he said.
As we sat there, breathing in sync with the slow rhythm of the winter morning, I felt a subtle shift deep inside. The Eve who had left 8 years ago, the Eve who'd stood under Manhattan's lights, wishing on a distant star, the Eve who'd just walked down a red-carpeted aisle in a small-town church, they all felt, for the first time, like the same person. Not a runaway, not a traitor to herself, just a woman making the best choices she could with the information she had, learning, one quiet realization at a time, that she was allowed to revisit old stories and see them more kindly. Eventually, we stood and began to walk back. The day ahead was not particularly dramatic. There would be leftover food, probably another round of congratulations from neighbors, decisions about where we were sleeping that night, small logistical puzzles to solve. Life would not explode into fireworks or fall neatly into place. But as we walked, our footprints appearing one by one behind us, I felt ready for that ordinariness, ready to find out what it meant to live through years, not just turning points. That night, whether in this bed in Eastborough or in the high-rise apartment in New York, I knew I'd eventually return to,
I would fall asleep with a heart that understood something it hadn't before, that there was no single perfect version of my life I had failed to live. There were paths and choices and people I loved. There was the soft weight of a ring on my finger. There was the memory of snow in a small town and city lights far away. And pulsing under it all was a quiet, steady invitation to keep breathing, to keep choosing, to keep forgiving myself for all the times I had believed I wasn't allowed to come home to my own heart. Whatever story unfolded next, it would begin from this gentler place. And that, more than anything, felt like the miracle I had really asked for when I looked up at a Christmas star and whispered a wish into the winter night.
I knew something was different the moment I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was smooth and high, not low and familiar. No tiny crack wandered lazily from a light fixture to the wall. Instead, recessed lights sat quiet in a pale, perfect surface. The faint hum I heard wasn't an old heater grumbling through vents, but something steadier. City plumbing, elevator cables, distant traffic. For a second, I didn't move. My body lay very still under a comforter that felt fluffier, more expensive than anything in my parents' house. The sheets were crisp and cool against my skin, with that faint hotel clean smell my New York apartment always carried after housekeeping visits. I inhaled slowly, and the air told me a story. A mix of fabric softener, city dust, and the barest hint of my own perfume. I was home. Or at least back. I turned my head. The dim digits of a bedside clock glowed in the soft early light. 7:12 a.m., December 25, 2004, Christmas morning. The numbers sat there as calmly as if nothing unusual at all had happened. My heart gave a slow, deep thump. Christmas morning, I thought, not Christmas Eve. The last thing I remembered, in that other place, in that other time, was walking back through Eastborough with Scott, snow crunching under our boots, my ring catching the winter light as we talked about paths and rooms and versions of ourselves. The memory didn't feel like a dream. It felt as solid as the mattress beneath me now. I lifted my left hand out from under the covers. The ring I saw was not the simple band from the small-town jeweler. It was the sleeker, more modern piece I'd chosen for myself after a promotion years before, a gift I'd laughingly called my commitment to the job. It caught the city light differently, throwing sharper reflections. I wiggled my fingers slowly, watching both rings in my mind at once. For a moment, grief swelled in my chest, hot and unexpected. Not because I preferred one life to the other, but because I had lived them both now, in some deep emotional sense. I had walked down the aisle toward Scott, and I had also walked up Madison Avenue toward my office tower. One path had not erased the other.
they existed together in me, layered and complex. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling.
Outside the large window, the city was quieter than usual. Christmas morning hush. Fewer horns, more distant, muffled sounds. I could just make out the muted sweep of a snowplow somewhere far below, and the soft whoosh of tires on slushy streets. I focused on my breathing. Inhale, cool city air. Exhale, the last clinging threads of panic I might have felt waking up between lives. I didn't feel panicked. I felt sad and grateful and oddly steady, all braided together. Eventually, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and let my feet find the floor. The wood was cool, but not shockingly so. As I stood, my body told me what it knew. This was my 2004 self, 33, seasoned by late nights, coffee, and clients. There was a faint tightness in my shoulders, familiar from years of carrying invisible weight. But under that was something new, a softness I recognized from kitchen mornings and bookstore afternoons. I walked slowly to the window. New York greeted me with its own version of Christmas. Snow clung to building ledges and fire escapes, turned gray at the edges where it met the street. Wreaths hung on some windows, ribbons fluttering gently in the cold. A few hardy pedestrians moved along the sidewalks in heavy coats and bright scarves, their breaths visible in small white puffs. The traffic was thinner, but the city was still itself, never fully asleep, just quieter. I pressed my palm lightly against the glass. It was cold, almost bracing. Christmas morning, alone in my apartment, the plan with Neil had evaporated in a brief, efficient message. The version of me who had stood in a Manhattan bar 2 nights earlier had felt hollow, brittle, untethered. The woman at the window now felt not full exactly, but no longer empty. "Okay," I said softly to the skyline, "I'm listening." Behind me, something rustled. I turned. On the low coffee table in the living area sat a takeout bag I recognized from the lobby cafe. Next to it, a to-go cup, and beside that, leaning casually against the cup, was a small folded card with my name on it in a handwriting I had definitely never seen on any client file. I walked over slowly, each step careful, as if the air itself might shatter if I moved too fast. The cardstock felt thick and smooth between my fingers. I unfolded it. In neat, slightly slanted script, it said, "You made a choice. Not the only one you could have made, but a real one. You don't owe the past a lifetime of punishment. Merry Christmas, Jay." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and felt a small, incredulous laugh bubble up from somewhere deep. "Of course," I murmured. The coffee was still warm when I wrapped my hands around it, the heat a pleasant surprise against my palms. I took a careful sip. It was exactly how I took it: 1 sugar, a bit of cream. The taste anchored me in the present moment. I sank onto the couch and let my body relax into the cushions. Pieces of both lives began to settle in my mind, not as competition, but as a strange, intricate mosaic. Eastborough, the bookstore, the way pine and paper and coffee had mingled in the air. My father's hand at my elbow, my mother's lists, Mandy's straight-shooting kindness, snow falling outside a small-town church, the weight of a simple ring and the feel of a soft dress. New York, the high light of my office windows, the buzz of Madison Avenue, long nights and big pitches, my apartment looking out over the city, the sharp ache of realizing I'd built success on a foundation of secrecy, the sting of Neil's changed plans, the glow of the bar on Christmas Eve. Both were true. Both were mine. For the first time since I'd left home 8 years earlier, I felt no urge to defend one against the other. My phone sat dark on the coffee table. Messages waited. Mandy, surely, with some snarky, affectionate comment about me going off the grid. Automated holiday greetings from the firm. Maybe even a brief, polite Merry Christmas from Neil, sent from a family gathering. I didn't reach for it yet. Instead, I closed my eyes and leaned my head back, feeling the rise and fall of my chest. Inhale, exhale. In that inner quiet, I thought of Scott, not with the sharp, unresolved ache I'd carried for years, but with a deep, bittersweet warmth. In some corner of the universe, or maybe only in the private geography of my heart, we had stood before friends and family and said real vows. We had walked through small town streets and talked about fear and choice and the meaning of a shared life. "Thank you," I whispered into the stillness, not just to him or to Brother James, but to the strange, merciful mechanism that had allowed me to see that version of myself. The knot of regret that had lived under my ribs for so long felt different now. Not gone, exactly, but looser. Less like a stone, more like a scar. Tender when pressed, but part of me. Eventually, I did pick up my phone. I scrolled through the messages briefly, eyes skimming more than reading. Then I opened a new one and hovered over the keyboard. Mandy, not my assistant in this timeline yet. She existed here as a sharp, efficient presence at the office. But I remembered another Mandy too, sitting on my parents' couch with Coco, telling me that any life I chose was allowed to be big in its own way. I typed slowly. "Hey, Merry Christmas. I know it's a holiday, but I've been doing a lot of thinking, and whenever you're free next week, I'd love to grab coffee and talk about a few changes I want to make. At work, and outside of it. No emergencies, just time for a reset." I read it twice, then hit send before I could over-edit it into oblivion. I did not text Neil.
There would be a conversation eventually. A real one, not whispered behind half-closed doors or fit into gaps between meetings. A conversation that might very well end whatever version of us we'd been pretending we had. But it could wait a day. For the first time in years, my life did not feel like it would collapse if I left an expectation unmet for 24 hours. Instead, I padded into the kitchen, still in my sleep shirt and socks, and opened the small cupboard where I kept the kind of things I always claimed I was too busy to use. On the top shelf sat a box of holiday tea I'd bought on a whim weeks ago and never opened. I took it down, breathed in the faint scent of spice and citrus, and set some water on to boil. The sound of the kettle heating filled the quiet apartment with a simple, domestic promise.
As I waited, I found a notepad and a pen. Not a resolution list, not a master plan, just a few lines. Things I'm allowed to do. Call my parents more than twice a year. Visit home without apologizing for not staying. Want meaningful work and real love at the same time. Leave situations that shrink me, even if they look impressive. Change my mind without hating who I was before. I paused, then added, remember that I was brave both when I left and when I stayed. As I wrote the words, I felt the truth of them settle through me. In that other December, standing in a little church with snow outside, I had chosen to stay. Here, in this December, looking out over a city shining under a winter sky, I knew I would choose, in small ways and big, to leave some things behind. An affair that kept me hidden. A company culture that rewarded only the parts of me that produced results and never needed rest. The common thread was not the geography. It was me, finally believing I was allowed to build a life that fit. The kettle whistled softly. I poured the water, watched the tea bag unfurl its color, and carried the mug back to the window. Outside, Christmas morning went on. Far below, someone walked a dog in a tiny red sweater. A couple carrying coffee turned a corner, their heads leaning toward each other against the cold. A lone cab rolled slowly through an intersection, its roof light off. I stood there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and let the city's distant sounds blend into a kind of urban lullaby. My breathing synced to it, slow, steady, unhurried. Somewhere beyond what I could see, lives went on in Eastborough too. A bookstore opened its doors, my parents brewed coffee, snow fell on crooked strings of lights. Maybe, in some quiet corner of the universe, a version of me was unlocking that door beside Scott, flipping on the lights and breathing in the scent of paper and possibility. I didn't have to choose anymore which of those memories was right. They were all part of the same woman now, the one standing at a New York window on Christmas morning, no longer convinced that she had ruined everything beyond redemption. Behind me, on the coffee table, the little card from Brother James lay open, the ink already drying into the fibers. You don't owe the past a lifetime of punishment. I took another sip of tea and closed my eyes. For the first time in a very long time, I let myself simply rest inside the present moment. No frantic rewrites, no endless what-if loops, no lists of failures. Just warmth in my hands, light on the snow, breath in my lungs. The miracle I realized wasn't that time had bent for me. It was that my heart had softened enough to let the same life feel different. Outside, the day brightened slowly. Inside, on a quiet Christmas morning in 2004, I began, not with a grand gesture or a dramatic decision, but with a gentle, private promise
to live the years ahead with more kindness toward the girl who had walked away, the woman who had built a career, and the newly awakened self who finally understood she was allowed, always, to come home.